Hey there, and welcome back. Settle yourself down, however you are lying tonight, and let the day go loose and quiet around you. This is one of those evenings made for slipping out of your own time and going to meet someone who lived and loved and died a very long while ago, and coming to know her not as a name in a list of queens, but as a person, a woman who was once as alive as you are now. It is for anyone who has ever wondered what it would be to be loved so completely that the love outlasts death itself, and who would like, tonight, to follow one such life from its bright beginning to its tender end. I would like to take you back more than 700 years to a girl born under the warm sun of Spain, who would become a Queen of England, and who, when she died, would be mourned by a hard and warlike king with a grief so vast that he marked the road of her last journey with 12 great crosses of stone, the length of a kingdom, so that she should never pass out of memory. Come with me if you are ready. Then let the centuries loosen and fall away, and come back with me to a sunlit court in old Castile, where a child is being raised among books and gardens and fountains. A child who does not yet know that she will die in a small manor house in the cold English Midlands, and that a king will weep for her across the whole of his realm. Before we begin that long journey together, let me say one quiet thing, the way I always do. If you find, somewhere along the road of this life, that you have been carried out of yourself and into another time, then you might think of subscribing, so that these journeys can keep coming to you on the nights you need them, and so that more of these lost lives can be told and remembered. It tells me which of these stories are reaching you out there in the dark. Now settle down to sleep while a tale of someone long gone unspools in the quiet. That is all I will ask of you tonight. Now let us go and meet her. Picture this: a courtyard in the south of Spain, in the kingdom of Castile, somewhere around the year 1241, and the sun lying gold and heavy on old stone, warmed through by the long afternoon. There is the sound of water, for there is always the sound of water in these courts. A fountain falling soft into a basin, tiled in blue and green and white. The patterns of it geometric and endless and beautiful. Brought by craftsmen whose fathers learned the art under the rule of the Moors. There are orange trees in the cool of the colonnade, and the scent of them hangs in the warm air, and beyond the courtyard wall the dry hills roll away golden under a sky of deep unbroken blue. This is a kingdom of light, of learning, of three faiths, living tangled and close. A kingdom where the courts of kings ring with poetry and music, and the patient talk of scholars, and where, on this warm afternoon, in the household of the King of Castile, a little girl is growing up, who will one day be carried far away from all of this warmth and light to a grey, wet island at the cold edge of the world, to be its queen. Her name is Eleanor. Let me take you to her and to the bright world that made her, before we follow her out of it and into her long and remarkable life. Let me show you the kingdom she was born into, for to understand Eleanor of Castile, you must first understand Castile itself, and the bright cultivated south that shaped her, because she carried that south inside her all her life, across all the cold years that came after, and it never left her. Castile in the middle of the 13th century was a kingdom at the height of a long and triumphant age, a Christian realm pushing southward, year by year into the lands the Moors had held for 5 centuries. And it was, just then, one of the most brilliant and learned places in all of Europe. Her father was the king, Ferdinand III, a warrior of relentless energy who spent his reign driving the frontier south, taking the great Moorish cities one after another, Cordoba with its vast and astonishing mosque, and then, in the year before Eleanor's birth or near it, turning his armies towards Seville, the richest prize of all, He was a soldier king, devout and tireless, and he would in time be made a saint by the church for his crusading zeal. But the kingdom he ruled was not merely a machine of war. It was a place where the cultures of the conquered and the conquerors lay layered one upon another, where Christian and Muslim and Jew lived and worked side by side in the cities, where the learning of the Arab world, its mathematics and medicine and astronomy and philosophy, was being gathered and translated and absorbed, where the very buildings the Castilians lived in were Moorish in their bones. All cool courtyards and falling water and intricate tilework and gardens made for shade and scent and contemplation. And the court of Castile, above all the court of her half-brother Alfonso, who would succeed their father, was famous across Europe as a gathering place of poets and scholars and musicians. Alfonso would earn the name by which history knows him, Alfonso the Wise, the Learned, a king who wrote and commissioned books on law and history and the movement of the stars, who gathered translators to render the wisdom of the Arabs and the ancients into Castilian, who composed songs to the Virgin in his own hand. This was the realm of Eleanor's childhood, a world where books were treasured and learning was prized, and a royal child, even a girl, might be taught to read and to love the written word. In an age when most of the nobles of the colder north could not read at all, she grew up among libraries and gardens and the talk of clever men, in courts of light and water and learning, and it gave her a cast of mind, a refinement, a hunger for beauty and for books. That would mark her out all her life as something rare and a little foreign in the rougher kingdom she was destined for. There is a thing worth pausing on here, before we go further, because it shapes everything that follows. Eleanor was a daughter of the South, of warmth and sunlight and high cultivation, of a court that read and built and made beautiful things. And the man she would marry, and the kingdom she would rule beside him, belonged to the north, to grey skies and green rain-soaked fields and stone, keeps built for war, to a culture that for all its strength was rougher, plainer, less given to the arts of peace. When Eleanor went north, she carried the south with her, in her tastes and her habits, and the very furnishings of her chambers, and she would spend her life in a quiet and unremarked way, bringing a little of the light and learning and beauty of Castile into the colder kingdom she had married. But that is to run ahead. For now she is only a child, in a sunlit courtyard, among the fountains and the orange trees, and we have her whole life before us. Let us look at the girl herself, and the kind of person she was becoming in those early years before the world came for her. We know less about Eleanor's earliest years than we would wish, for the chroniclers of that age rarely troubled to record the childhoods of girls, even royal ones, and she enters history clearly only when she becomes useful to the plans of kings, which is to say, when she is old enough to be married. But we can see the shape of her childhood well enough, in the world we have just walked through, and in the woman she became, and we can say with some confidence what kind of girl was being made in those years. She was one of a large family, as royal children were, the daughter of Ferdinand III by his second wife, Joan, the Countess of Ponthieu, a Frenchwoman who had brought her own lands and her own blood into the Castilian line. Eleanor had brothers, older and younger, and the half-brother Alfonso, who would be king, and she grew up in the moving household of a conquering court, following her father's progress through the kingdom, from city to city. As the frontier rolled south and the great Moorish capitals fell one by one into Christian hands. She would have known Seville as a new possession, freshly taken, its mosque becoming a cathedral, its palaces passing into the hands of her family. She grew up, in other words, inside a story of triumph, the daughter of a king who was winning, in a kingdom at the very crest of its fortunes. And she was educated, which is the part that matters most for understanding her. In the learned courts of her father and her brother, a clever royal daughter was not left to grow up idle and unlettered. She was taught to read and given books, and brought up among people for whom the written word and the made beautiful thing were not luxuries, but the very substance of a noble life. We can read her education backward, from the woman she became, for the Eleanor of later years was a passionate collector and commissioner of books, a queen who kept her own scribes and illuminators, who loved gardens and had them made wherever she went, who brought craftsmen and goldsmiths and refinements of every kind into England, who was, by the standards of the 13th century English court, an astonishingly cultivated woman. None of that came from nowhere. It came from these years, from the sunlit learned South, from a girlhood spent among books and gardens and the talk of scholars, and she carried it north with her and never set it down. As to what she was like, this girl, as a person, here we must be honest and say that we cannot truly know, that the inner life of a child 7 centuries gone is closed to us, and that anyone who paints her too vividly is inventing. But the outlines of a character do come through the record, faintly across the years. She was clearly intelligent and clearly strong-willed, a woman who, in later life, managed vast estates and drove hard bargains and held her own in a court of powerful men. She was capable of deep and lasting attachment, as her marriage would prove beyond any doubt. And she had, it seems, that particular steadiness of the truly self-possessed, the quality of a person who knows who they are and where they come from, and does not bend to the place they find themselves in, but quietly bends the place a little toward themselves. She was, in short, a daughter of Castile to the end of her days. However long she lived in England, however completely she gave herself to her English husband and her English crown. Hold that in mind as we go on, the steadiness and the strength and the deep-rootedness in the bright world of her birth, because she is about to be taken from that world very young and sent into a life she did not choose. And it is that rootedness that will carry her through. Now the wide world of kings comes for her, as it always came for royal daughters, and to understand why a girl of Castile was sent to marry the heir of England, we must step back from the sunlit courtyards and look at the hard game of power that was being played over her head. For Eleanor's marriage was not a romance at its beginning, but a treaty, a piece of statecraft, a knot tied between two kingdoms to settle a quarrel. And the quarrel was about a place called Gascony. Gascony lay in the southwest of what is now France, a rich land of vineyards and ports, and it belonged, in that age, to the King of England, the last great remnant of the sprawling French Empire that the English kings had once held and had mostly lost. The English crown clung to Gascony, for it was wealthy, and it was proud of it, but it was far away and hard to hold, and it had a dangerous neighbour, for just across its southern border lay Castile. And the kings of Castile had an old claim of their own to Gascony, a claim they could press whenever it suited them. In the early 1250s this claim grew sharp and threatening. Alfonso, soon to be king, let it be known that he might make good his rights in Gascony by force, and the English king, Henry III, a man never strong and just then, beset by troubles at home, had no wish at all to fight a war in the south against the power of Castile. So the kings did what kings did. They turned a threat into a bargain, and they sealed the bargain with a marriage. If the heir of England would take a daughter of Castile to wife, then Castile would drop its claim to Gascony and stand as England's friend instead of its enemy, and the troublesome border would be made safe by blood. Henry III's heir was his eldest son, the Lord Edward, a young man already tall and strong and promising, 15 years old, and Castile had a daughter near the right age, the king's half-sister Eleanor, about 13. And so it was arranged, in the cool, calculating manner of such things, by men who would never have to live inside the marriage they were making. Eleanor was not consulted. She was a counter in a game, a means of binding two crowns, and her wishes, if she had any, are nowhere recorded and were nowhere considered. This was the ordinary fate of a princess, and she would have known it from her cradle that she was born to be married where her family's interest sent her, to a man she had never met, in a country she had never seen. There is something that catches at the heart in this, when you set it beside what the marriage would become. For this bargain, struck so coldly over a strip of disputed land, this knot, tied by tired diplomats to avoid a war, would grow into one of the deep love stories of the medieval age. A marriage of such closeness and devotion that it astonished the men who recorded it, and that we still tell the tale of 700 years on. The thing began as pure statecraft, as nearly all royal marriages did, with no thought of love in it at all, only of Gascony and peace and the binding of two crowns. And out of that cold beginning grew a tenderness that would, at the very end, raise 12 crosses across the face of England. But the children at the centre of it knew none of that on the day the bargain was struck. They knew only that they were to be wed, the tall English prince and the small Castilian princess, and that the day was coming when they would be brought together for the first time at the altar to begin a life that neither of them had chosen. Let us go to that day now, to the wedding itself, in the vast abbey of Llywelgas at Burgos, in the autumn of the year 1254. Come with me then to Burgos in the late autumn of 1254, to the royal abbey of Llywelgas, a fine house of nuns founded by Eleanor's forebears, its church cool and high and shadowed, a place fit for the wedding of a king's daughter. The Lord Edward had come south through Gascony to claim his bride, and to be made a knight by Alfonso's own hand as part of the bargain. And now, on the first day of November, the two of them stood together at the altar for the first time, the prince and the princess, to be made man and wife. Picture them as they would have been. Edward at 15 was already remarkable to look at, very tall, taller than other men, long in the leg, which would earn him in time the nickname Longshanks, fair-haired, strong, with the restless physical force that would mark him all his life as a soldier and a hunter. Beside him, Eleanor was small, dark, a girl of about 13, slight and self-possessed, dressed in the rich Castilian fashion, her dark hair and dark eyes and southern colouring strange and lovely beside the fair northern prince. They had not met before, or barely. They could not speak easily to one another, for he had his languages and she had hers. They were children, by our reckoning, standing up in a foreign right, to be bound together for life by the will of others, for reasons of state. And yet the part was done with all the solemnity and splendour the two kingdoms could muster. The church bright with candles, the magnates of Castile and the English party gathered, the vows made, the blessing given, and the marriage sealed. It was, by the custom of the age, a real and binding marriage from that day, though the bride was so young, and there is some sign that Eleanor may have borne a child very soon after, a child that did not live, which tells us something hard about the world she had entered, where girls were made wives and mothers while they were still children themselves, and where the losing of infants was the common grief of every woman, queen or peasant alike. But set that aside for the moment and stay with the wedding, with the two young people at the altar in the candlelit abbey, because this is the hinge on which the whole of Eleanor's life turns. Until this day she was a daughter of Castile, of the south, of the sunlit learned south we have walked through. From this day she belongs to England, to the north, to the tall fair prince beside her, and to the cold kingdom he will inherit. She is being handed across at 13 from the only home she has known into a world she has never seen. And here is the quiet miracle of it, the something that lifts this story above the 100 other cold dynastic marriages of the age. Most such marriages were endured rather than enjoyed. The partners did their duty, produced their heirs, and lived their separate lives under the one crown, with affection if they were lucky, and with cold civility if they were not. But Edward and Eleanor, married as children for the sake of Gascony, grew into one another with a completeness that was rare then and would be rare in any age. They became, over the years, almost inseparable. You two people who could hardly bear to be apart, who travelled together, crusaded together, who were rarely more than a few rooms distant from one another across 36 years of marriage. Whatever was in that wedding at Burgos, whatever spark passed between the tall boy and the small dark girl, it took and it held and it grew into something that would outlast them both. But all of that lay ahead, unguessed, on the day they were wed. For now there was only the slow road north to be faced, the journey out of the sunlit south and into the unknown, and to that road we turn next. The journey from Castile to England was slow and wearying in that age, a matter of many weeks, and for a girl of 13, leaving her home for good, it must have been a passage out of one life and into another as final as any crossing can be. She would travel north through Gascony first, into the English lands in the south of France, and there she lingered a while, for there was business to settle, and she was very young, and only later did she make the final crossing to the island kingdom that was now her home. But come with her, in your mind, on that slow road, and feel what it was to make it. She was leaving the warmth. That is the first thing, the plainest thing, and it would have struck her in her very body. She was leaving the gold light and the dry hills and the falling fountains and the orange trees, the cool tiled courtyards and the bright learned court, the language she had spoken from her cradle and the family she had known all her life. And she was going north, ever north, into greyer skies and colder air and longer rains, toward a green wet island at the edge of the known world where the sun was pale and the winters were dark and the people spoke tongues she did not have. She was 13. She would in all likelihood never see her homeland again, never again walk in those courtyards, or hear that water, or speak that language with the ease of home. She was being carried out of the south forever into a life chosen for her by others among strangers, in the cold. And when at last she came to England, it must have seemed strange indeed. The English court was rich, but it was not cultivated, as the courts of Castile were cultivated. The great stone castles were built for defence and for cold, draughty and dim, their comforts rough beside the cool elegance of the south. The land was green and soft and rainy, beautiful in its own northern way, but utterly unlike the dry gold country she had left. The people were proud and insular and wary of foreigners, and a Spanish bride, with her strange dark looks and her foreign ways and her train of southern attendants, was not at first warmly received. There is a story much repeated that when she arrived the chambers prepared for her were hung in the Castilian manner with rich tapestries and carpets spread upon the floors, and that the English, who were used to bare boards and rushes, gawped at this foreign luxury and thought it absurd and extravagant. The tale may be embroidered, but it carries a truth. The truth that Eleanor brought the south with her into the north, her fabrics and her colours, and her notions of how a high lady should live, and that England found her strange, but she did not bend. That is the thing to hold on to. The steadiness we spoke of, the deep-rootedness in herself and in the bright world that made her. Eleanor did not arrive in England and dissolve into it, become a pale imitation of an English lady to please her hosts. She brought her own world with her, and she kept it all her life. The carpets and the tapestries, the books and the gardens, the goldsmiths and the fruit trees and the southern refinements. And over the years, she did not so much surrender to England as quietly furnish it, leaving it a little warmer and brighter and more cultivated for her having passed through. And at the centre of that long quiet work of making herself at home stood the one thing that made all the rest bearable, the one part that turned a cold dynastic exile into a life worth living, which was her marriage. The bond with the tall, fair prince, growing year by year into the deep partnership that would define them both. Let us watch that bond take root now, in the difficult early years, when England itself was about to be torn apart by war, and the young couple would face their first great trial together. Between the strange cold arrival and the breaking of the realm in war, there were some years, quiet years by the measure of the chroniclers, who pass over them quickly. And yet they were the most important years of all for what this marriage would become, for it was in them that the part took root. The wedding in Burgos had bound two children for reasons of state. These early married years were when the bound children, slowly, quietly, became a man and a woman who had chosen one another. They were both very young still. Edward grew through these years from a youth into a powerful young man, tall and restless and able, finding his strength. Eleanor grew from the 13-year-old bride into a young woman, learning the kingdom, learning its language and its ways, making her place in a court that had not welcomed her, beginning the deep, quiet work of furnishing her exile with the things she loved. They were often together, for they were young and married, and the great storms had not yet come. And across these years, in a way no chronicle records, because nothing dramatic happened. They grew into one another, grew used to one another, grew, somewhere in the ordinary days, into love. We cannot watch it happen. No one wrote it down. But we can see that it happened by what the marriage became. By the fact that when the storms did come, the war and the danger and the long separation, the bond held, which it would not have done had these quiet early years not first made it strong. There is a truth here about how love of the deepest kind is actually made, and it is worth sitting with. We tend to imagine love as a something that strikes, sudden and complete, a lightning bolt at a first meeting. But the love that lasts a lifetime, the love that raises, crosses the length of a kingdom, is more often made the other way, slowly, quietly. In the ordinary days, by two people living alongside one another, year after year, until they have grown together at the root, until the other has become the very ground one stands on. Edward and Eleanor did not fall in love at the altar in Burgos. They were children, strangers, married for Gascony. The love came after, grew after, in the unrecorded ordinary years, the patient work of a shared life, until one day, without either of them perhaps quite noticing the moment, they had become the thing they would be for the rest of their lives. Two people who could not bear to be parted, and that perhaps is the most hopeful part in this whole story, for those of us who hear it in the dark. The greatest love of the medieval age, the one marked in stone the length of England, did not begin in love at all. It began in a cold bargain over a strip of land, between two children who had never met, and it grew anyway into something deep and true and lasting by the slow, ordinary work of a life lived together. Love was not the beginning of this marriage. Love was what the marriage made over the years out of duty and proximity and the long, patient sharing of a life. There is a quiet encouragement in that the deepest bonds are not always struck like lightning, but are often grown like trees, slowly, in the ordinary years, into something that can stand against any storm. Let us go on now to the first of the storms that tested what these quiet years had grown, the breaking of the kingdom into war. The England that Eleanor came into was a kingdom sliding towards civil war, and the first long trial of her marriage would be lived out against the breaking apart of the realm. To understand it, you must know a little of the king she had married into, her father-in-law, Henry III, and the troubles he had brought upon himself. Henry was a gentle, pious, artistic man, the king who rebuilt Westminster Abbey into the soaring church that still stands. But he was a weak and unsteady ruler, generous to foreign favourites, careless with money, forever quarrelling with his barons over how the kingdom should be governed and who should govern it. By the early 1260s, the quarrel had grown into a crisis, and the crisis into a war. The great barons, led by a brilliant and formidable man named Simon de Montfort, rose against the king, demanding that he rule by counsel and law rather than by his own will and his favourites. And the kingdom split into two armed camps, the king's party and the baron's party, and the land fell into the chaos and danger of civil war. The Lord Edward, Eleanor's husband, now a grown man in his 20s, was at the very heart of it, fighting for his father's crown against Montfort and the barons, and these were perilous years for him and for Eleanor both. There was a time when the royal cause went badly, when Montfort held the upper hand, when Edward himself was for a while a prisoner, and when Eleanor, the foreign princess, the Spanish wife, was a figure of suspicion and danger, bound up with the unpopular foreign connections of the crown. For her safety, she was sent away out of England to wait out the worst of it in France, separated from her husband while he fought for his life and his inheritance, not knowing, through those long months, whether he would win or lose, live or die, whether she would return to a throne or to ruin. These were the years that tested what the wedding at Burgos had made. A marriage of mere convenience might have frayed under such a strain, the partners flung apart by war and danger, each looking to their own survival. Theirs did the opposite. Edward fought his way back from defeat with a cold brilliance that would mark his whole later career, broke the barons utterly at the Battle of Evesham in the summer of 1265, where Montfort himself was killed, and restored his father's crown and his own inheritance. And Eleanor came home, in the autumn of that year, to a husband victorious and a future secured, and the bond between them, far from breaking under the strain, had deepened. They had faced danger and separation, and the real possibility of ruin, and they had come through it together, and from this point on, the record shows them ever more closely bound, ever less willing to be parted. Two people who had learned in the hard years that what they had in one another was the surest thing in a dangerous world. The realm was at peace again. Edward was the rising power behind his aging father's throne, and the young couple could turn at last to building a life and a family. But Edward was a man with a great vow upon his soul, a vow he meant to keep, and it would carry them both together to the far end of the known world. Let us turn to the Crusade. In the year 1270, the Lord Edward took the cross. That is the old phrase for it, for a man who vowed to go on crusade had a cross of cloth sewn upon his shoulder as the sign of his vow. And Edward, devout and ambitious and hungry for the great deeds of his age, vowed to go east to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem and the Crusader states, to fight for the cross against the armies of Islam, as kings and princes of Christendom had been doing, in waves of blood and faith, for nearly 200 years. It was the supreme adventure and the great duty of a Christian prince, and Edward meant to do it. And here is the moment that tells you, more plainly than any other, what this marriage had become. For when Edward went east, Eleanor went with him, this was not the way of things. Crusade was men's work, brutal and dangerous, a matter of armies and sieges and the long deadly road across the sea, and the wives of crusading princes stayed home, kept their households, raised their children, and prayed for their husband's safe return. A queen did not sail to the war. A queen did not take the Crusaders' road into the heat and the danger and the disease of the Holy Land. But Eleanor did, and the chroniclers, casting about for an explanation of so unusual a thing, but recorded that she said, or was said to have said, that nothing ought to part those whom God had joined together, and that the way to heaven was as near from the Holy Land as from England, or words to that effect. We cannot be sure the words were truly hers. Such sayings were often put into the mouths of the great by those who wrote of them, but whether she said it or not, she did it, which is the surer testimony. For she left her kingdom and her young children and sailed east into the war at her husband's side, because she would not be parted from him. And that simple fact speaks louder than any reported speech. Think of what it meant. She was leaving behind her children, the little ones born through the years of the marriage, leaving them in England in the care of others, not knowing when or whether she would return. For the crusade was a deadly business, and many who took the cross never came home. She was sailing into heat and plague and battle, into a foreign war on a foreign shore, with no certainty of anything but danger. And she chose it freely, in so far as a woman of her age could choose anything, because the alternative was to be parted from Edward for years, perhaps forever, and that she would not do. There are marriages in which the partners are glad enough of a long parting. Theirs was not one of them. She would rather face the perils of the crusade at his side than the safety of England without him. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, in the quiet, because it is the heart of who these two were to one another. We have grown used, in our age, to thinking of medieval royal marriages as cold arrangements, loveless bargains struck for land and blood, and most of them were. But here, in the choice to sail east together into the war, is the plainest proof that this one had become something altogether different, a true and deep companionship, a partnership of two people who had decided, somewhere across the years since that wedding in Burgos, that they belonged together and would not be separated, not by war, not by danger, not by the whole breadth of the world between England and Jerusalem. So they sailed, the two of them, east across the Mediterranean toward the Holy Land, and we will follow them there to the Crusader city of Acre, where the adventure waited and where the marriage would face its sharpest trial of all. The road to the Holy Land was hard and slow, even for princes. They sailed the length of the Mediterranean, that vast inland sea, putting in at the islands and the ports of the south. The way to the east measured in weeks and months of salt and sun and the heave of the ship. They paused in Sicily and in the Crusader staging grounds, and there came word that the King of France, the saintly Louis, who was to have led this crusade, had died of disease at Tunis on the African shore before Edward even reached him. So that the great expedition fell apart before it began, and Edward sailed on east with only his own following, a smaller venture than had been dreamed. But he sailed on, for he had taken the cross and he would keep his vow. And so in the spring they came at last to Acre, the crowded Crusader city on the coast of the Holy Land, the chief stronghold of what remained of the Christian states in the east, a teeming, sweltering port fortress crowded against the sea. Picture it as Eleanor would have found it, a walled city of stone baking, under a sun fiercer than any she had known, even in Castile. Its harbour thick with shipping, its narrow streets, a press of soldiers and merchants and pilgrims of every nation. The air heavy with heat and dust, and the sea and the smells of a crowded city in a hot land. Beyond the walls lay the territory of the enemy, the powerful Mamluk armies of the Sultan Baybars, a soldier far abler than the crusaders who faced him, and the Christian hold on the Holy Land was by now a thin and failing thing. A handful of coastal cities clinging on while the tide of Islam rose around them. Into this hot and dangerous and dwindling world Eleanor came, the queen who would not stay home and made her household amid the war. And in the midst of it, in that crusader city under the eastern sun, she did the part that women did, war or no war, danger or no danger. She bore a child. A daughter was born to her there at Acre, in the Holy Land, and the child was named Joan, and all her life she would be called Joan of Acre, for the place of her birth, a name that carried the mark of that strange far episode forever after. A princess of England, born in a crusader fortress on the coast of Palestine, while her father waged his holy war. There is something that catches the imagination in it, the queen giving birth in the heat and danger of Acre, life going on in the very teeth of the war. The ordinary miracle of a child coming into the world in the least ordinary of places. It tells you again what manner of woman this was, that she was there at all, that she made a household and bore a child and kept her husband's hearth in a besieged crusader city at the edge of Christendom, calm and rooted and unbowed, as she had been calm and rooted and unbowed since she was a girl of 13, carried north out of the sun. But Acre held a darker part in store for them than heat and siege, a part that would nearly end the story altogether, far sooner than its true ending, and would give rise to the most famous tale that is told of Eleanor of Castile, a tale of love and poison and a desperate act at a sickbed. The campaign itself came to little, for Edward had too few men to achieve great things, and in the end he made a truce with the Sultan and prepared to turn for home. But before he could leave, in the heat of an eastern summer, an assassin came for him, and the marriage faced the sharpest and most sudden trial of all its years. Let me tell you what happened, as nearly as we can know it, and then let me tell you the story that grew up around it, and you may hold both in your mind together, the truth and the tale. It was June, in the year 1272. The story comes down to us in several versions, and they differ in their details, as such stories do, but the shape of it is clear enough. A man came to Edward claiming to bring messages, a man who had been about the prince's household, trusted, admitted to his presence, perhaps a convert, perhaps a spy, certainly an assassin in the pay of the prince's enemies. He gained a private audience, and when he was close, in the heat of the chamber, he drew a hidden dagger and struck at Edward with it, a deep and dangerous wound, and the blade, it was believed, had been smeared with poison. What followed showed the soldier that Edward was. Wounded as he was, he fought back at once, struck the assassin down with his own hands, wrestled the dagger from him, and killed him there in the chamber. But the wound was done, and it was bad, and the poison, if poison there was, began its work. The flesh around the cut grew dark and inflamed, and would not heal, and the prince's life hung in real danger. For there was little the medicine of that age could do against such a thing, far from home, in the heat, with the venom spreading. The physicians and surgeons were called, and they conferred over the blackening wound, and at last an English surgeon judged that the only hope was to cut, to take a knife and pare away all the poisoned and corrupted flesh around the wound, and leave only the clean, a brutal remedy and a doubtful one, but the only one that offered any chance at all. Now here is where the truth and the tale divide, and I will give you both, for you should have both. What the soberest accounts tell us is this, that before the surgeon could do his grim work, Eleanor had to be led from the chamber, weeping and crying out, for she could not bear to watch what was to be done to her husband, and that she was taken away in her distress, while the surgeons cut the poison from him and saved his life. That is the likely truth, and it is moving enough in itself. The wife so stricken with terror and grief at her husband's danger that she had to be carried from the room. But a later and more romantic age was not content with it, and out of it grew the famous legend, the tale that is told to this day, that Eleanor herself saved him, that she set her own mouth to the poisoned wound and sucked the venom out with her lips, risking her own life to draw the death out of his in an act of pure devotion. It is a beautiful story. It is almost certainly not what happened. The chroniclers nearest the event say it was the surgeon's knife that saved him, not the queen's mouth, and some even credit one of his knights with the sucking of the wound, not Eleanor at all. And yet the legend endured and grew and was painted and carved and retold down the centuries, and there is a reason it endured, which is worth pausing on as you lie there in the quiet. The story of Eleanor sucking the poison from Edward's wound is not true, in all likelihood as a matter of fact. But it is true as a matter of meaning, for it caught and held and passed down something real about this marriage. The something that everyone who knew them seems to have felt, that here was a love so complete that the wife would have done such a thing, would have given her own life to save his. That the bond between them was of the kind that such legends naturally gather to. People did not invent that story about cold dynastic couples who endured one another for the sake of the crown. They invented it about Edward and Eleanor because it fitted what was known of them, because it was the kind of thing their love made believable. The fact is, a surgeon's knife. The truth, the deeper truth, is a wife who had to be carried weeping from the room because she could not bear to see her husband suffer, and a marriage out of which such legends grow. Edward lived. He healed slowly and gathered his strength and prepared at last for the long road home. And on that road, before they ever reached England, the world would change beneath them, and the prince and his queen would become a king and his consort. Let us go home with them now, all the way out of the east and back toward the north and the crown that waited. The journey home from the Holy Land took the better part of 2 years, for Edward travelled slowly, recovering his strength. And the road wound back through the kingdoms of the Mediterranean and up through Italy and France toward the sea and England. And as they came, news reached them, the slow, heavy news of that age that travelled by ship and horse and took weeks to arrive, and the news that came to them on the road was of death, of one death and then another, falling upon them out of the distance as they made their way home. First came word that one of their little sons, a boy named John, left behind in England in the care of the family, had died, a small child gone while his parents were half the world away. One of those losses that fell on nearly every family of the age, and fell on this one across an unbridgeable distance, so that they could not even have been at the child's side. And then, as they came further on, near Italy, came the greater news, the news that changed everything, that the old king, Henry III, Edward's father, had died at last in England after his long and troubled reign, and that Edward was now, by that death, the King of England. The Crusader prince had become a king while he was still on the road home from his crusade, and the woman at his side, the small dark girl from Castile carried north at 13, was now the Queen of England. There is a thing that strikes the modern mind here, and it is worth marking. Edward was now king, and yet he did not hurry home. The kingdom was quiet, his position secure, the government in steady hands, and so the new king and queen took their time, travelling home at their own pace, doing the business of a great prince along the way, visiting, settling affairs. And they did not reach England for many months after the old king's death. A crown could wait in that age on a king who knew his throne was safe. And so it was not until the late summer of 1274 that Edward and Eleanor came at last to England to be crowned together at Westminster in the soaring abbey that Henry had rebuilt, king and queen of the realm, in a ceremony of high and ancient splendour. Picture that coronation, the climax of all the years since Burgos. The girl who had come to England a foreign bride, strange and unwelcome, hung about with suspicion in the war years, was now crowned and anointed queen in the heart of her adopted kingdom, beside the husband who had become the whole centre of her life. She was in her early 30s now, no longer the child of the wedding, but a woman grown, tested by war and exile and crusade and the loss of children, mother of a growing family, partner in every sense to the most powerful man in the land. Whatever England had thought of her at her coming, she was its queen now, crowned and consecrated, and she would be its queen for 16 years, until her death. The long apprenticeship was over. The reign had begun. Let us look now at the queen she became, and the unusual life she lived at the side of her king. For it was a life unlike that of almost any other queen of the age. Let me take you to the day she was crowned, for it was the high public summit of her life, the moment the foreign bride became, formally and forever, the Queen of England, and it is worth standing inside it for a while. It was the late summer of 1274, and Edward and Eleanor had come home at last from the long years of crusade and travel, and they were to be crowned together at Westminster, king and queen of the realm, in the abbey at the heart of the kingdom. Picture the day. Westminster Abbey, the soaring new church, full to its high stone vaults with the great lords of the realm, the bishops and the earls and the barons. The whole power of England gathered to see its king and queen made. The candles in their hundreds, the gold and the colour, the rich vestments of the clergy, the chant rising into the heights, the incense, the press of the crowd, the whole vast and ancient ceremony of a coronation, the oldest and most solemn rite the kingdom had. And at the centre of it, the two of them, Edward and Eleanor, brought to be anointed and crowned. The climax of everything since the wedding in Burgos 20 years before. Feel what it would have been for her, the small dark girl from Castile, now a woman in her early 30s, standing in the great northern church to be made its queen. She had come to England, a foreign bride, strange and unwelcome, gawped at for her southern ways, mistrusted in the war years, a stranger in a cold land. And now she stood in the holiest place in the kingdom, before all its great men, to be anointed with holy oil and crowned with the crown of England, consecrated queen, bound to the land and the people by the most sacred rite there was. The strangeness of the early years, the homesickness, the suspicion, all of it behind her now, and the crown of England being set upon her head in the abbey before the realm. She had given her whole life to this kingdom, and now the kingdom, in this great ceremony, took her formally to itself, made her its own, its anointed queen. There is a particular weight to a coronation that is hard for us to feel now, in an age that has lost the sense of the sacred that filled such moments for the people of that time. To them, this was no mere pageant. The anointing with holy oil set the king and queen apart from other mortals, touched them with something of the divine, made them sacred persons, the Lord's anointed, bound to God and the kingdom in a way that could never be undone. Eleanor, kneeling to be anointed and crowned in the candlelit abbey, was being changed, in the belief of her age, into something more than a woman, into the consecrated queen of a Christian realm, set apart, sacred, bound to England by the holy oil until her death. And it was in this same abbey, where she was crowned and made sacred queen, that she would lie at the last, when all the years of her queenship were done, the gilded effigy resting near the place of her crowning. the beginning and the end of her queenship, gathered into the one vast church. Hold the gold and the candlelight and the solemn weight of that crowning day. The foreign girl made sacred Queen of England at last, as we go on through the years of her reign. A queen of the 13th century was a great institution as much as a person, and Eleanor as queen stood at the head of her own vast household, a moving organization of perhaps 150 people who travelled with her wherever she went and saw to her every need, a small kingdom in itself, with its own officers and its own treasury and its own intricate order. Let me show you something of it, for it is the frame within which she lived the second half of her life. And it tells you what it was to be a queen in that age, not idle and ornamental, but the lord of a great enterprise. At the centre of her household was the wardrobe, which despite its name was not a room for clothes, but the financial and administrative heart of the whole establishment, the office that received her revenues and paid out her money and kept her accounts. And it is largely from the dry, careful records of this wardrobe, the rolls of receipts and payments that survive, that we know so much of the daily texture of Eleanor's life, what she bought and what she gave, where she travelled and whom she paid, the small material traces of a life lived 7 centuries ago, preserved in the patient bookkeeping of her clerks. Around the wardrobe ranged the rest of the household, the stewards and the knights and the ladies, the cooks and the grooms and the chaplains, the scribes and the goldsmiths and the gardeners, the whole moving company that made up the court of a queen, and went where she went, packing and unpacking, loading the carts, raising and striking the vast machine of the household at castle after castle, manor after manor, as the court moved ceaselessly about the land. And Eleanor ran it. This is the thing to understand. She was no passive ornament, no decorative consort kept apart from affairs. She was an able and energetic manager of her own great estate, a businesswoman in all but name, who oversaw her revenues and her lands with a sharp and personal attention, who knew her accounts and her holdings and drove her affairs with a will. The same steadiness and strength we saw in the girl of Castile shows here in the Queen. In the firm hand she kept on the running of her household and the gathering of her wealth. She was clever, and she was capable, and she was not idle. And the records show a woman deeply and personally engaged in the management of everything that was hers, from the greatest estate down to the smallest payment. But the most unusual thing about Eleanor's queenship was not the size of her household or the sharpness of her management. It was where she took it. For most queens, the great household was based, settled in its palaces and manors, while the king roamed the kingdom about his business of war and government and justice. Eleanor did not stay settled. Eleanor went with him. Wherever Edward travelled, and Edward travelled endlessly, for he was a restless and active king, forever on the move about his realm and his wars. Eleanor and her household travelled too, at his side, so that the two courts moved together across the face of the land, year after year, rarely apart. It was an extraordinary thing, and it is the clearest sign in all the long record of the reign of what these two were to one another, that the queen would not keep a settled court in comfort while the king roamed, but packed up her whole great household and took to the road beside him, again and again, for the plain reason that she would not be parted from him. Let us look closer at that travelling life, the endless road, the moving court. The marriage lived out on horseback across a kingdom, for it is the very picture of who they were. Imagine a life lived almost entirely on the move, not the settled life we think of for a queen, enthroned in one great palace, but a life of perpetual travel, the court forever packing and unpacking, the carts forever loaded and unloaded, The household forever raised and struck, as the King and Queen of England moved ceaselessly about their kingdom, from castle to manor to abbey to hunting lodge, rarely staying long anywhere, always going on. That was the life of Edward and Eleanor for the 16 years of their reign together, and it is worth dwelling on, because it is so unlike the still and stately picture we carry in our minds of medieval royalty. There were reasons for all this movement beyond the king's restless nature, though that was real enough. A medieval court travelled partly out of sheer necessity, for no one place could feed and supply so vast a company for many days, and the court ate its way through the stores of one estate and moved on to the next, spreading the heavy burden of its keeping across the king's many holdings. It travelled to do the work of ruling, for justice and government in that age were personal, carried by the king's own presence into the corners of the realm, so that to rule was to be seen, to move among the people and the lords and the courts of the land. And in Edward's reign it travelled to war again and again, north and west, into Wales for the hard campaigns of conquest, and later towards Scotland. For Edward was a soldier king who spent much of his reign in the saddle on campaign. Through all of it, the wars and the progresses and the endless ordinary movement of the court, Eleanor was there, on the road, at his side. Think of what that life was, in the body, day by day. The long hours on horseback, or in the jolting carriages of the age, over the bad roads of medieval England, in all weathers. The rain and the cold and the mud of the north that must have struck so hard at a daughter of the bright south. The constant making and unmaking of home, never settled in one bed, never long in one hall. The household, a matter of canvas and cart and perpetual motion. The discomfort of it, the weariness of it, for a queen who might have stayed warm and settled in a southern palace and let her husband roam. And she chose the road, year upon year, the cold and the mud and the endless going on, because the alternative was to be parted from him. And that, still, after all the years, she would not do whatever drew the small dark girl and the tall fair prince together at the altar in Burgos, had not faded with time and familiarity and the wearing of the years. It had deepened into a settled and unbreakable habit of facing the whole long restless business of a reign side by side, on the road, in the saddle, sharing the discomfort and the danger and the daily grind of it, rather than apart in any comfort. We should be careful, here, not to paint it too sweetly, for it was a hard life as well as a devoted one. And Eleanor was no soft and sentimental figure, but a tough, capable, strong-willed woman who bore the rigours of that travelling life because she had the iron to bear them. But the devotion was real, and it was remarkable, and it left its mark on every record of the reign. The clerks of the wardrobe tracked the court's endless movement in their rolls, manor after manor, castle after castle, and through all of it, the king and queen moved together, the two households travelling as one. The marriage lived out not in the stillness of a palace, but in the perpetual motion of a kingdom ruled from the saddle. And in the midst of all that movement, that hard and restless travelling life, Eleanor did the other great work of a queen and a woman of her age, the bearing and raising of children, on the road, year after year, a long procession of births and, too often, of small graves. Let us turn to that now, to Eleanor the mother, for it is one of the most moving threads of her whole story. Let me set you down for a while, inside that travelling life, so that you can feel it from within and not only hear it described, for a life is made of days, and the days of Eleanor's queenship were spent largely on the road, and there is a texture to them worth feeling as you lie there in the quiet. Picture then A day with the court on the move, somewhere in the English Midlands, in the middle years of the reign. It begins before light, in the grey cold of an early morning, in whatever castle or manor or abbey the court has rested in for the night. And the first thing is the sound of it, the whole machine of the household stirring and waking. The calling of voices in the dark courtyards, the clatter and stamp of horses being brought out and harnessed, the rumble of the heavy carts being loaded with all the vast moving substance of a royal household, the beds and the hangings and the plate and the kitchen gear and the documents and the treasure, everything packed and corded and heaved onto the wagons in the cold dawn. You would wake to that, the noise of a court preparing to move, and rise in the chill, and be dressed, and hear Mass, for the day in that devout age began with the Mass. The priest, and the candles, and the murmured Latin in the cold chapel before anything else was done. And then the long day's travel. Out through the gates in the early light, the whole long train of the court winding out onto the road, the king and queen riding near the head of it, with their households about them, the knights and the ladies, the clerks and the servants, the carts groaning behind, the whole company strung out along the muddy road through the English country. Feel the day of it in the body. The cold air and the damp, the grey northern light, so unlike the gold of Castile, the green wet country rolling slowly past, the rain when it came, the mud thrown up by the hooves and the wheels, the slow hours in the saddle or the jolting carriage, the slow patient pace of a great company, moving only as fast as its slowest cart. It was wearying, it was uncomfortable, it was endless, and Eleanor did it year upon year. The daughter of the warm south, riding through the cold wet north at her husband's side, because she would not be left behind. And at the end of the day, as the light failed, the arrival, the court coming at last to the next resting place, another castle, another manor, another abbey, and the whole great machine going into reverse. The carts unloaded, the household unpacked, the fires lit, the hall made ready, the beds set up, the moving home raised once more for a night or a few nights before it was struck again and moved on. And there, at last, in the evening, after the day's hard travel, the warmth and the rest, the fire and the food and the company, the king and queen together at the end of another day on the road, as they had been together at the end of so many days, and would be at the end of so many more. That was the life, day after day, year after year, the perpetual movement, the cold and the mud and the weariness, and through all of it, the one constant, the two of them together, sharing the road. The marriage lived out not in the stillness of a palace, but in the endless motion of a kingdom crossed and crossed again. It was a hard life and a remarkable one, and she chose it every day of it, for the sake of not being parted from him. Hold the feel of it, the cold road and the warm evening, and the two of them together at the heart of the moving court, as we turn back to the threads of her story. Eleanor bore Edward many children. The exact number is not perfectly certain, for the records of that age are imperfect, and some infants slipped into and out of the world almost without trace. But it was somewhere around 16 children across the slow years of the marriage, born in England and in Gascony, and one, as we have seen, in the Crusader city of Acre. 16 children. Sit with that number for a moment, for it tells you the shape of a medieval royal woman's life more plainly than anything else could. Through her childbearing years, she was, in effect, almost continuously pregnant or recovering or nursing, bearing child after child after child, on the road, in the perpetual movement of the court, the central work of providing the dynasty with heirs falling on her body again and again across 2 decades. And here is the hard truth that lies beneath that number, the truth that every mother of that age lived with, and that we, in our safer world, can scarcely imagine. Of those 16 children, more than half did not live to grow up. They died as infants, as small children, taken by the fevers and the sicknesses and the frailties of an age that had no defence against them, one after another, so that Eleanor, like nearly every mother of her time, from the queen to the poorest village wife, knew again and again the particular grief of burying a child. Little ones born in joy and gone within months or years. A procession of small losses running through the whole bright fabric of her life. The son John, who died while they were away on crusade, and others before and after, the babies who did not survive, the children who slipped away. We tend to imagine that people of that age, who lost children so commonly, must have grieved them less, hardened to it by its very frequency. The evidence does not bear this out. They grieved as we would grieve. The commonness of the loss did not blunt the sorrow of it. It only meant that the sorrow came again and again. But children survived, and grew, and Eleanor saw a number of her daughters and one precious son come safely through to adulthood, and they were the joy and the future of the line. There were the daughters, a whole bright company of them. There was Eleanor, the eldest to survive, who would marry a count across the sea. There was Joan, born at Acre, strong-willed like her mother, who would make a marriage and then, scandalously, a second marriage for love, to a man far beneath her, and weather her father's fury over it. There was Margaret, who would become a duchess in the Low Countries. There was Mary, who was given to the church as a nun, as royal daughters sometimes were, dedicated to God at a vast abbey. And there was Elizabeth, the youngest of the daughters to live, who would marry and become a countess. A company of royal daughters, raised in the moving court, sent out one by one to their marriages and their convents and their places in the wide web of European nobility. And there was the matter of a son, an heir, which weighed on every royal marriage, for a kingdom needed a male heir to pass to. And here Eleanor's fortune was harder. Sons were born to her, but the sons were frail, and they died, one after another, the longed-for heirs slipping away in childhood while the daughters lived. For many years the heir was a boy named Alfonso, named for Eleanor's Castilian brother, a child who lived into his boyhood and seemed set to inherit. And then, late, when Eleanor was past 40, in the year 1284, in a newly built castle in conquered Wales, she bore one last son, a boy named Edward for his father, Edward of Caernarfon, after the place of his birth. And in that same year, the older boy, Alfonso, the heir of so many years, died. A child still, so that the whole inheritance of the crown of England came suddenly to rest on the last baby, the infant born in Wales, who would one day be king. The weaving of fate in it is almost too neat to be true, and yet it is true. The old heir dying in the very year the new heir was born, the crown passing in a single year from one small boy to another. That last son, Edward of Caernarfon, would live and grow, and in time become King Edward II, but his mother would not see it. Let us turn now from the children to the Queen herself, to the cultivated, book-loving, garden-making woman she was. The daughter of Castile, who quietly enriched the kingdom she had married. Let me linger a little longer on the children who lived, and on the daughters especially, for they were the part of Eleanor's labour that bore fruit and went on into the world. And one of them in particular has a story that throws a sudden vivid light back onto her mother and her family, and it is worth the telling. The surviving daughters were a remarkable company, raised in the moving court and sent out, one by one, into the high marriages and the religious houses that were the destiny of royal daughters. The eldest to live, named Eleanor for her mother, married a count across the sea and became a countess in a foreign land. Margaret became a duchess in the Low Countries. Elizabeth, the youngest to survive, married and became a countess too, woven into the high nobility of the realm. And Mary was given to God, made a nun at a noble abbey while still a child. Dedicated to the religious life as royal daughters sometimes were, to pray for her family and live out her days within the cloister. They were scattered, as royal daughters were always scattered, sent where the interests of the dynasty sent them, into marriages and convents across England and Europe. The daughters of the travelling queen going out to their own appointed places in the wide web of medieval power. But it is Joan, born at Acre in the heat of the Crusade, who carries the most human story, and it tells you something of the blood she came from. Joan was married first, as a rich heiress should be, to a powerful and much older earl, a marriage of high policy that brought the crown a valuable alliance. But the earl died, and Joan, young and widowed and strong-willed, did then the most extraordinary thing. She married again, in secret for love, and not to some great lord, but to a simple squire of her own household, a man far beneath her in rank. A love match utterly against the interests and the dignity of the crown. Her father, the king, was furious, in the towering rage that Edward was capable of. For a royal daughter to throw herself away on a household squire was a scandal and an affront. There was a great quarrel and a reckoning, and for a time Joan was in deep disgrace. But she held to her choice and weathered her father's fury, and in the end the king relented and accepted the marriage, and Joan kept the husband she had chosen for love. There is something of her mother in that, in the strength and the will and the refusal to bend, and something too that lights up the whole family from a new angle. For here was a daughter of this famously devoted marriage, raised by parents who had themselves grown from a cold dynastic bargain into a true and chosen love. And when her own moment came, Joan reached for love over policy, married where her heart sent her against all the interests of her rank, and held to it against the rage of the most powerful man in the kingdom. Whether she learned it from her parents' example or simply carried their strong blood, it is hard not to see in Joan of Acre's defiant marriage for love an echo of what her mother and father had found. The conviction that the bond between two people might matter more than the calculations of kings. Eleanor did not live to see the worst of that quarrel, perhaps. But the daughter born to her in the Crusader city carried something of her into the next generation, the same strength, the same will, the same readiness to hold to a love against the world. Let us turn back now to Eleanor herself and to the inner life of the cultivated queen in the years of her power. Of all the things Eleanor brought from Castile into England, the most lasting and the most herself was her love of beauty and of learning, the cultivated southern soul that she never set down. And it is in this, perhaps more than in anything, that we can see her most clearly as a person. Across the centuries, by the things she loved and made and gathered about her. She loved books, above all, in an age when books were rare and precious objects, each one written and painted by hand, the work of months, costly beyond the reach of all but the great. Eleanor kept her own scribes and illuminators in her household, men who copied and decorated books for her, and she gathered a library and commissioned works, and had romances and histories and devotional books made for her own reading and her own pleasure. a queen who valued the written word in a court where many a great lord could not read a line. This was the daughter of Alfonso the Wise's Castile, showing through. The child raised among the libraries and translators of the most learned court in Europe, carrying that hunger for the book north with her and keeping it alive in the colder kingdom. One of the most literate and book-loving figures of her English age. She loved gardens too, and made them wherever she settled long enough to make them, gardens in the southern style she had grown up among, with their careful plantings and their water and their fruit. She is credited with bringing new refinements of gardening into England, new plants and new ways, the influence of the sunlit south on the cooler northern ground, and she had fruit trees planted, and is associated in the records with the bringing in of fruits not common in England before, the produce of the warmer lands she came from. Wherever the endless travelling court paused, Eleanor's love of the made and growing beautiful thing left its small mark. A garden here, an orchard there, a little of Castile planted in English soil. And she loved fine, made things of every kind, the work of goldsmiths and craftsmen, rich fabrics and tapestries and carpets, the elegant furnishings that had so astonished the English at her coming, and that she kept about her all her life. So that her chambers, wherever she was, carried something of the colour and warmth and refinement of the south into the grey stone of the north. There is something quietly moving in all this, when you think about it as you lie there in the dark. Here was a woman taken from a warm and brilliant world at the age of 13, and set down in a colder, rougher one, for the rest of her life, with no choice in the matter and no road home. And she did not simply endure it, grey and homesick, nor did she dissolve into her new country and forget the old. She brought her world with her and kept it, and quietly, over 36 years, made her corner of England a little more like the place she had loved and lost. Warmer, brighter, more cultivated, full of books and gardens and beautiful made things. So that the kingdom she married was left, by her passing through it, a little enriched, a little softened, carrying forward into its future some small inheritance of the bright south she had carried north as a girl. It was a gentle kind of conquest, the opposite of her husband's, who took Wales by the sword and built his castles to hold it. She took nothing and held nothing by force. She simply brought what she loved and let it spread, and left the place better for it. But we would do her a disservice and tell only half the truth if we left the portrait there, all gardens and books and gentle refinement, for Eleanor was a real woman and not a plaster saint. And there was another side to her, harder and more worldly, that the honest record will not let us ignore. Let us look at that side now, fairly, for it makes her more real and not less. Let me set you down once more inside her world, in a quieter scene this time, away from the road and the war and the business of the crown, in one of the still moments of her life, so that you can feel the texture of the things she loved. Picture a chamber in one of the royal castles, on an afternoon when the court has paused and there is for once no travelling to be done, and the queen is at her ease among the things that were most truly hers. The room is warmer and brighter than an English chamber of that age had any business being, because she has made it so. There are carpets on the floor, the rich patterned carpets she brought from the south and kept about her all her life, soft underfoot where English floors were bare-board and rush. There are tapestries and hangings on the cold stone walls, worked in deep colours, keeping out the draught and the chill, and cushions and fine fabrics. The whole room furnished with a southern richness that sun-lighted and softened the hard northern stone. A fire burns on the hearth, and the light comes in through the window and falls on the thing that is most hers of all, the books. for she is at her books, the cultivated queen, in one of the rare still hours. Picture the books themselves, for they are nothing like the books we know, each one a treasure, written and painted by hand on fine parchment, the months of labour of a scribe and an illuminator, bound in worked leather. The pages bright, with painted pictures and gold leaf that catches the firelight, the letters formed with a care and a beauty that made each book a work of art. She keeps her own scribes and painters to make them, and she gathers them, romances and histories and books of devotion, and she reads in an age when most of the great around her could not. The daughter of learned Castile, keeping the love of the written word alive in the rough north. Feel the quiet of that hour, the fire and the carpets and the soft light, the queen bent over a painted page in the warm room. The rare stillness of a life mostly lived on the move, gathered for a little while into peace among the beautiful made things she loved. And perhaps, when the weather is kind, she walks in a garden she has made, for she made gardens wherever she could, in the southern style, with their careful plantings and their fruit trees, and if it could be managed, the sound of water, a little echo of the courtyards of her childhood carried north and planted in English ground. Picture her there, in the green quiet of a garden she has caused to be made, among the herbs and the flowers and the young fruit trees, the grey northern sky above, but a small patch of the cultivated south about her feet. The queen who could not go home, walking in a garden that brought a breath of home to her. These were the still centres of her restless life, the books and the gardens and the warm, rich chambers, the small kingdom of beauty she carried with her through all the cold and the travel and the years, and they are, perhaps, where we can see her most truly as herself, not the queen of state or the wife on the road or the mother of the dynasty, but simply Eleanor, the cultivated soul from the warm south, at her ease for an hour among the things she loved. Hold that quiet image of her, the queen among her books in the warm bright room, as we go on toward the kingdom and the age she lived in. The harder side of Eleanor was her hunger for land, and it is well attested, and it drew real complaint in her own lifetime, and an honest telling of her life must give it its place. For it is part of who she was, and it makes her human. She was, as we have seen, a sharp and able manager of her own affairs, energetic in the gathering of wealth and the building up of her estates, and in the pursuit of that wealth she was not always gentle, and she made enemies. And she left a stain on her reputation that the chroniclers did not trouble to hide. The means of it lay in the money-lending of the age, and in particular in the debts owed to the Jewish community of England, who were permitted to lend money at interest when Christians were forbidden it, and who held bonds against the lands of many an indebted lord and knight. Eleanor acquired such bonds, the debts of others, and through them she acquired the lands that secured them, taking over estates when their owners could not pay, building up her holdings by working the hard machinery of debt. It was legal, and it was the way wealth was gathered in that world, but it was resented, for it meant that lesser families lost their lands into the hands of the queen, and the resentment found its way into the record, into the complaints of those who suffered by it, and into the warnings of churchmen who feared for the queen's soul. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself, a serious and reforming man, wrote to her with concern about these dealings, urging her to make restitution, to give back what had been wrongly gathered, troubled by the methods and by the stain they left. There was even, the record suggests, a saying that went about, a sour little rhyme or proverb to the effect that the king wished to get hold of the people's gold and the queen their fair manners. A bit of popular grumbling that tells you how the thing was seen by those it touched. Eleanor was not loved by everyone in her lifetime, whatever the legends made of her afterward. To some, she was the grasping foreign queen, the Spanish woman who gathered English lands into her hands through the debts of the unfortunate, and there is no use pretending otherwise, for it is part of the true picture. She was acquisitive. She drove hard bargains. She built her wealth by methods that troubled even the head of the English church, and that left bitterness behind her among those who lost by them. And yet set this in its place, and do not let it swallow the whole. She lived in a hard and worldly age, in which the gathering of land and wealth was the very business of the great, and she did what the powerful did, only more ably than most. Her husband defended her, and after her death troubled himself to make some restitution on her behalf, to set right what her dealings had left wrong, an act that itself tells us something of his care for her soul and her memory. And the same qualities that made her grasping made her formidable. The strength and the sharpness and the iron will that we have seen in her since she was a girl, the capability that ran through everything she did. She was not a soft woman, not a gentle ornamental queen. She was tough, clever, worldly, and strong, a real and complicated human being, capable of deep love and of hard dealing both, of making gardens and of taking lands. And she is the more real to us, and the more interesting, for being so, a saint would be less than she was. Let us hold the whole of her, then the cultivated and the acquisitive, the loving and the hard, as we follow her into the last years of her life, the height of her fortunes before the shadow falls. The years of Eleanor's queenship, the 15 and more years from the coronation to the end, were the height of her fortunes and of Edward's, the central span of a reign that ranks among the most powerful in the long line of English kings. Edward was a formidable king, hard and able and tireless, a lawgiver and a conqueror, and at the centre of all his striving, through all of it, was the queen who travelled at his side, sharing the height of his power as she had shared the danger of his youth. In the year 1279, Eleanor's fortunes rose further still, for her mother died across the sea, and Eleanor inherited from her the county of Ponthieu, in the north of France, a real and substantial territory, which she now held in her own right, a countess as well as a queen, ruler of her own continental lands. It made her richer and greater, and it brought new territory into the orbit of the English crown, for Ponthieu would pass in time to her son. She was now a queen of England and a countess of Ponthieu, a great lady of two realms, mistress of wide lands on both sides of the sea, at the very summit of what a woman of that age could be. And these were the years of Edward's great work, the conquest of Wales, the hard campaigns by which he broke the independent Welsh princes and bound their land to the English crown, ringing the conquered country with a chain of mighty castles. The carved stone fortresses of Caernarfon and Conwy and Harlech and the rest, among the most formidable castles ever raised in these islands, built to hold Wales down forever. Eleanor was there in Wales through these campaigns, for she travelled with Edward as always, and it was in the newly built castle at Caernarfon, in the very heart of the conquered land, that she bore her last son in 1284, the boy who would be king. There is a tale, almost certainly a later invention, that Edward promised the conquered Welsh, a prince who spoke no word of English, and then presented them with his infant son, born among them, a babe who could speak no language at all. The story is charming and false, but the fact beneath it is real enough, that the heir to England was born in a Welsh castle in the midst of the conquest, the son of the travelling queen who went wherever her husband's wars and works took her. So picture Eleanor at the height of her life, in her 40s, a queen and a countess, mother of a surviving son at last, mistress of great wealth and wide lands, partner to the most powerful king in the island's history, still travelling at his side through the triumphs of his reign as she had through the dangers of his youth. The frightened 13-year-old carried north out of Castile had become one of the great figures of her age, secure, powerful, rich, and in the one thing that seems to have mattered to her most. Still bound in deep companionship to the husband she had given her whole life to. It was the summit of her fortunes. From here, the only road was down, though no one knew it yet, and the descent, when it came, would come without warning. On a journey north, like 100 others, in the autumn of the year 1290. But before we follow her to that last road, let us pause and look more closely at the heart of her whole story, the marriage itself, and at the man she loved, for it is the marriage in the end that makes her remembered. And we should understand it fully before we come to its breaking. It is worth stepping back for a chapter from the Queen herself to the kingdom and the age she lived in. For Eleanor was not only a wife and a mother and a cultivated woman, but the consort of a mighty king at one of the turning points of the island's history, and she lived her life against the backdrop of mighty events. And her story sits inside a larger one that gives it its weight. The England of Edward and Eleanor was a kingdom, being forged into something harder and more unified than it had been, under one of the most formidable kings it would ever have. Edward was a builder of law and government, a king who reshaped the courts and the statutes and the machinery of rule in ways that endured for centuries, who summoned the assemblies that would grow in time into parliament, who bound the kingdom more tightly under the crown than it had been before. He was a conqueror who broke the independence of Wales forever and ringed it with the mightiest castles in the land, and who spent the long bitter end of his reign trying and failing to do the same to Scotland. He was, in his hardness and his energy and his ambition, a king who left the island permanently changed, and Eleanor lived the whole of her queenship at the side of that striving, sharing the height of one of the great reigns of English history. And it was, for all its hardness, a brilliant and creative age, as well as a brutal one, the high noon of the medieval age. These were the years of the great cathedrals rising across Europe, of the soaring Gothic churches with their stone lace and their glass-like jewels, of Westminster Abbey itself newly raised in the new style. They were the years of the friars, the new orders of preachers and teachers, the Dominicans Eleanor loved and the Franciscans, moving among the people with a new and vivid faith. They were the years of the universities taking shape, of learning gathering and growing, of the slow flowering of the medieval mind at its richest. Eleanor, with her books and her learning and her cultivated southern soul, was very much a woman of that brighter side of the age, a patron and a lover of the arts and letters that were the glory of her time, even as her husband embodied its harder face of war and conquest and law. To see her whole, then, you must see her against this wide backdrop, the consort of a kingdom-shaping king, a figure at the centre of power in a turning age, sharing in the making of an England that would outlast them both. She was no mere ornament to the reign. She was the king's closest companion through the whole of it, the one who travelled with him and shared his counsel and drew out the better part of him, present at the heart of one of the great reigns of the island's history. And when she died, it was not only a husband who mourned, but a kingdom that lost its queen, and the grief that raised the crosses was the grief of a realm as well as a man. The public mourning of a great queen of a brilliant age, marked in stone the length of the land for all to see. Hold that larger frame about her now, the brilliant, hard-turning age, and the kingdom-shaping reign, as we return to the close of her own particular life and to the long rest at the end of it. There is an arc to Eleanor's standing in England that is worth tracing on its own, for it runs quietly underneath the whole of her life, and it makes the grief at her death more remarkable still. And it is this: that she came to England unwelcome and left it mourned, that the foreign bride the kingdom had eyed with suspicion became by the end a queen whose passing was marked the length of the land. Remember how she began, in English eyes. A Spanish girl, strange and dark, with her foreign ways and her foreign attendants and her carpets and her tapestries that the plain English thought absurd, brought in to seal a bargain over Gascony. A stranger from the south, set among them as their future queen. She was not loved at her coming, and in the troubled war years she was a figure of suspicion, bound up with the unpopular foreign connections of the crown. A foreign woman in a kingdom wary of foreigners. And even later, in her queenship, she was not universally loved, for there was the matter of the lands and the debts, the hard gathering of estates that drew the complaints we have spoken of, the sour proverb about the queen and her manners. For much of her life Eleanor was, to many of her English subjects, the foreign queen, admired perhaps, feared perhaps, but not warmly held. And yet when she died, the kingdom mourned her, and not only the king. The grief that raised the crosses was public grief, a realm marking the passing of its queen, and somewhere across the years, beneath the suspicion and the complaints, England had taken her to itself after all. Part of it was simply the king's grief, so vast and so public that it swept the kingdom along with it, made her death a great event that the whole land must mark. But part of it, surely, was that 36 years is a long time enough for a foreign bride to become simply the queen. The only queen most of her subjects had ever known. Woven into the life of the kingdom by sheer length of presence, by the births and the progresses and the decades, until her foreignness faded, and she was, at the last, just Eleanor, the king's wife, England's queen, mourned as one's own are mourned. There is something quietly hopeful in that arc, when you think about it in the dark, the way a stranger can become, over a lifetime, no longer a stranger, the way suspicion can wear away into acceptance and acceptance into belonging, given only time enough and life enough lived among a people. Eleanor was never English, never stopped being the daughter of Castile, carried her foreign soul to the end. And yet England, which had eyed her so warily at her coming, mourned her at her going as deeply as it ever mourned a queen, marked her death in stone the length of the realm, and remembers her of all its medieval queens. Perhaps the best, 700 years on. The stranger became the beloved, the foreign bride became the mourned queen. It took a whole lifetime to do it, but it was done, and there is a comfort in that for anyone who has ever felt themselves a stranger in the place they have come to live, that belonging can be won in the end. Simply by living, by staying, by giving your life to a place until the place takes you at last for its own. Let us turn back now toward the close of her life, with that whole long arc of her belonging held in mind, and follow her to its tender end. Let me tell you about the man she loved, for you cannot understand the grief that ended this story unless you understand what he was, and what it meant that such a man loved such a woman so completely. Edward I was not a gentle king. He was, by any measure, one of the hardest and most formidable men ever to wear the English crown. And the tenderness he showed his wife is all the more striking set against the iron of the rest of him. He was a giant of a man for his age, very tall, powerful, physically fearless. A soldier to the bone who spent his life in the saddle and on campaign. He was a brilliant and ruthless commander, the conqueror of Wales, the hammer of the Scots, as a later age would call him. A king who broke his enemies without mercy and held what he took with stone and steel. He was a lawgiver of the first rank, who reshaped the law and government of England in ways that lasted for centuries. He had a famous and terrible temper, a rage that could terrify those around him. He was, in his dealings with the Welsh and the Scots and the Jews of England, whom he would in time expel from the kingdom entirely, capable of great hardness and great cruelty. This was no soft and sentimental man. This was one of the most powerful and intimidating figures of the entire medieval age, a king whose very name struck fear. And this man loved Eleanor of Castile with a depth and constancy that nothing in the rest of his hard nature would have led you to expect. Across 36 years he kept her at his side, would not be parted from her, took her to war and on crusade, and through every campaign and progress of his restless reign. He trusted her, relied on her, drew strength from her, and the chroniclers, hard-headed men recording the deeds of a hard-headed king, noted the closeness of the royal marriage as something remarkable, something that stood out even to contemporaries used to the ways of kings. There was, it seems, a softness in him that only she could reach, a tenderness that only she drew out. And when she was gone, the men who knew him said that his rule grew harsher, that the better part of him went out of him with her, that her death changed him for the worse. She was, in some real sense, the thing that kept the vast, hard king human. We should be careful, as ever, not to sentimentalize a medieval marriage into a modern romance, for they were people of their own age and not of ours. And the bond between them was woven of duty and dynasty and the long habit of a life shared as much as of anything we would call love. But when all the cautions are made, the plain fact remains, written across the whole record of the reign, and sealed at the last in stone, the length of a kingdom, that these two were bound to one another by something deep and real and rare, something that 36 years and 16 children and endless travel and war and danger did not wear away, but only deepened, and that when it was broken by death, the hardest king in England's history was broken with it, and showed his grief to the whole realm in a way that no king had ever shown it before or would again. That is the marriage, that is the love at the centre of this story. And now, having understood it, we must follow it to its ending, to the last journey north in the autumn of 1290, when the lifelong companionship came, without warning, to its close. Before we come to the ending, let me draw out one more thread of who she was, the thread of her faith, for she was a woman of her age in this as in all things. And her religion was not a thing apart from her life, but woven through the whole of it, and it shaped how she lived and how she died and how she was mourned, and we cannot follow her to her end without it. She was, like all her world, a devout Christian, raised in the intensely religious court of a crusading and saint-making dynasty, the daughter of a king who would himself be canonized, the wife of a man who took the cross and crossed the world to fight for the faith. Religion was the very air of that age, the frame within which every life was lived and understood, and Eleanor lived inside it as naturally as she breathed. She gave to the church, founded and endowed religious houses, supported the friars, in particular the Dominicans, the order of preachers, to whom she was especially devoted and who would, at the last, receive her heart. She went on pilgrimage, kept the feasts and fasts, heard Mass daily, lived by the deep rhythms of the Church's year and the Church's teaching, and held, as everyone held, the great hope and the great fear of that faith, the hope of heaven and the fear of judgment, the conviction that this life was the short prelude to an eternal one, and that the soul's fate hung on how it was lived. This is why the dealings we spoke of, the hard gathering of lands through debt, troubled the churchmen so, and why they pressed her to make restitution, for it was her soul they feared for. The eternal reckoning that awaited a woman who had gathered wealth by methods that bore hard on others. And it is why, when she came to die, and after she had died, so much thought and treasure went to the care of her soul, to the masses and the prayers and the endowments that would be offered for her forever, to speed her through the purging that awaited the dead and into the bliss of heaven. To these people, the death of the body was not the end of the story, but a passage, and the living owed the dead the long labour of prayer to help them through it. And Eleanor, in her dying and her mourning, would receive that labour on a scale almost without equal. Masses founded to be said for her soul in perpetuity, candles kept burning for her. The whole machinery of medieval devotion turned to the speeding of her soul toward God. There is a tenderness in this that reaches across the centuries when you understand it rightly. Edward's grief, when it came, did not only raise crosses of stone, though it did that. It poured out too, in this other and deeper form, in the endless provision for her soul, the masses and the prayers and the candles, the turning of the king's whole power and wealth toward the one thing he could still do for her, once she was beyond his reach in this world, which was to pray her, and pay others to pray her, toward heaven. The crosses were for the world to see, the public monument of a king's grief. But the masses and the prayers were the private heart of it, the husband doing for his dead wife the only thing left that a husband could do, tending her soul as he could no longer tend her body, across the border of death. Hold that in mind as we go to the ending now, for the ending is not only a death and a funeral and a row of stone crosses. It is a man losing the centre of his life and turning every power he has in this world and toward the next, to honouring and helping the soul of the woman he could not keep. Let us go then to the last journey to the autumn road north in the year 1290. In the autumn of the year 1290, the king and queen set out northward. As they had set out on 100 journeys before, the great travelling court on the move again across the face of England, the carts and the households and the long retinue winding along the autumn roads. There was nothing to mark this journey from any other, nothing to warn them, no shadow on the road. It was an ordinary progress, the kind they had made together, year upon year for the whole of their reign, the king about his endless business, the queen at his side as always. They were heading toward Lincoln, in the East Midlands, and the court moved by stages through the cooling country as the leaves turned and the year drew down toward winter. But Eleanor was not well. She had not been fully well for some time, the records suggest, troubled by a recurring fever, the kind of slow, wasting fever that the medicine of that age could neither name with certainty nor cure, that came and went and sapped the strength. That may have been a form of the marsh fever, the ague, that haunted the low, wet country of medieval England, returning again and again to weaken those it gripped. She had borne it as she bore everything, with the toughness that had carried her through a lifetime of travel and childbirth and hardship, and she had kept to the road, kept at her husband's side, kept on with the journey north. But as the court came into the country near Lincoln, the fever took a firmer hold, and she grew worse, too ill to go on, and they had to stop. They stopped at a place called Harby, a small village in Nottinghamshire. just over the county line from Lincoln. And there, in the house of a man of the gentry, an ordinary manor house and no palace, the Queen was put to bed, too sick to travel further. Think of the strangeness and the smallness of it, after the life she had lived. This was a woman who had been born in the palaces of Castile, who had been crowned at Westminster, who had kept court in the mighty castles of England and Wales, and in the Crusader fortress of Acre, mistress of wide lands in 2 realms. And now, at the end, she lay sick in a modest manor house in a little English village, far from any of the great places of her life. Brought low by a fever, in a borrowed bed in the flat, cold country of the Midlands as the November dark came down. The greatness of the life and the smallness of the setting of its ending press hard against one another, and there is a kind of terrible ordinariness in it. The Queen dying as anyone might die, in a plain house, of a fever, far from home, and Edward came to her and stayed. This is the thing the records make plain, that the king was there, at Harby, at her side, through the last of it. He had been about his business when she fell so ill. But he came to her, and he remained with her, in that small house, as the fever did its slow work and the Queen sank toward her end. The most powerful man in the island, the hard conqueror, the hammer of his enemies, sat by the bed of his dying wife in a borrowed manor house in a Midland village through the long November days. And there was nothing in all his power that could do the one thing he would have given it all to do, which was to keep her. The strength that had broken the Welsh and would break the Scots was of no use here. He could only sit and watch and wait and be with her as she slipped away from him after 36 years. In the small house at Harby, as the year and her life ran down together toward the dark. Let us go to her bedside now, gently, for the ending, and then we will follow what the king did with his grief. She died on the 28th of November, in the year 1290, in the evening, in the small manor house at Harby, with her husband beside her. She was about 49 years old. She had been Queen of England for 18 years, and the wife of Edward for 36. Since the day they were married as children in the abbey at Burgos, a lifetime ago and half a world away, under the warm Castilian sun she had not seen since she was a girl. We do not know her last words, if she spoke any that were remembered, for the chroniclers who recorded the death of a queen were more concerned with the public fact of it and its great consequences than with the private words of a deathbed. And so the last things she said, if she said anything, have not come down to us, and we should not invent them. What we know is the plain shape of the ending. The fever that had troubled her for so long had at last proved too strong, and her body, worn by a life of travel and by the bearing of 16 children and by the years, could not throw it off, and she sank and weakened and died in the quiet of that small house as the November night came on. It is the oldest and commonest of human endings, a body failing, a life going out. And it came to a queen exactly as it comes to everyone, gently or hardly, in a bed, with the dark gathering, whatever the greatness of the life now ending. There would have been the rites of the church about her as she went, for she died in a believing age and among devout people, and the comfort of the faith would have been given her. The prayers and the sacraments that eased a Christian soul out of the world and commended it to God. She had lived inside that faith all her days, and she died inside it, surrounded by its rituals and its hopes, with the priests and the prayers about her and her husband at her side, passing, as her whole age believed, not into nothing but into the keeping of God, through the gate of death and toward the judgment and the mercy beyond it. Whatever fear there is in dying, she met it held in the frame that had held her whole life, the deep certainty of her time that death was a passage and not an ending, that the soul went on, that she would be prayed for and remembered and in the fullness of time raised. And then she was gone, and the long companionship of 36 years was over, and the king sat beside a wife who was no longer there. Let us not crowd the moment with too many words, for some things are best met plainly. A woman died in a small house on a November evening 700 years ago. She had been a frightened child carried north out of the sun, and a young wife tested by war, and a queen who would not be parted from her king, and a mother many times over of joy and of grief, and a cultivated and formidable and complicated woman, and the beloved of one of the hardest men of her age. And now she was none of these. Now she was only the still figure on the bed, and the grief of the man beside her, and the soul gone out into the dark toward God. The fever had taken her, the life was over, and what happened next, what the king did with the enormity of his loss, is the act for which she is remembered above all. The thing that turned a private grief into a monument that still stands, the length of a kingdom 7 centuries on. Let us follow Edward now into his grief and see what he made of it. Edward's grief was enormous, and he did not hide it, and the scale of it astonished even those who recorded it. Here was a man not given to softness, a king whose temper men feared, and whose hardness in war and rule was a byword. And when his wife died, he was undone by it, plunged into a mourning so deep and so public that it left its mark on every account of the time and on the very face of England, in stone, where it can still be seen. The men who knew him said that he was never quite the same afterward, that something went out of him with her, that the better and gentler part of the king died at Harby with the queen, and that his rule in the years that followed grew harder and more arbitrary, as though her death had loosed something in him that her life had held in check. He stayed at Harby in the first days, in the house where she had died, in the rawness of the loss, and he wrote, in those days, words of his grief that have come down to us in part. For he sent word of her death to the great religious houses and asked for their prayers, and in his message to the monks he spoke of how he had loved her, living, and how he would not cease to love her now that she was dead. The exact words shift between the tellings, and we should not pretend to a precision the records do not give us. But the substance is clear, and it is moving in its plainness. A king declaring, in the first shock of his loss, that death had not ended his love, that he loved her still and would go on loving her, that she was gone from the world, but not from his heart. From the hardest king in England, in the rawest hour of his grief. That simple declaration carries a weight that a softer man's finest words could not. And then he did the thing that turned his private grief into the public monument that outlasted them both. He resolved that her body should be carried south, all the long way from near Lincoln to Westminster, to lie at last in the great abbey among the kings, and that the journey should be made with all honour, the body borne in solemn procession, stage by stage down the length of England, resting each night on the way. And he resolved, further, that at every place where her body rested, for the night on that long road south, a great cross of stone should be raised, a monument, to mark the spot the dead queen had lain, so that the whole route of her last journey should be written across the country in stone, a line of crosses running the length of a kingdom, each one a place where Eleanor had rested on her way to her grave, each one a sign to all who passed of the king's love and the queen's passing. 12 such places there would be, and 12 such crosses, the most elaborate monuments of their kind that England had ever seen, and they would stand, some of them, for 700 years and more. Long after the grief that raised them was itself only a story. There is something in this that goes beyond the ordinary mourning even of kings, and it is worth dwelling on as you lie there in the quiet. Grief is common. Everyone grieves. But Edward's grief reached for permanence, for a way to write his loss into the very ground so that it could not be forgotten, so that the memory of her would be fixed in stone the length of his realm and outlast his own life and the lives of all who knew her. It was the act of a man who could not bear that she should simply pass and be forgotten, who turned the whole of his power and wealth, as he had turned it to war and conquest, now to the single end of remembering his wife, of making her death a thing written permanently across the face of England. Kings had built tombs for their dead before. No king had ever done quite this, marked a dead queen's last journey with a chain of monuments the length of a country. It was unique, and it was the measure of the love and the loss. And it is why. Of all the queens of medieval England, it is Eleanor of Castile, whose name still lives, carried down to us on the crosses her grieving husband raised. Let us follow that last journey now, that road south, stage by stage, and see where her body rested, and where the crosses rose. Before the slow road south could begin, there was grim and necessary work to be done, for it was late November, and the journey to Westminster would take the better part of a fortnight, and a body cannot be carried so far, so slowly, without being prepared to endure the passage. And so, in the days after her death, in the house at Harby and then at nearby Lincoln, the Queen's body was embalmed, made ready for its long last journey by the methods of that age which were thorough and, to our eyes, hard to contemplate, though they were done with reverence and were the ordinary practice for the bodies of the great, who must be carried far to their burial. It was in this preparing that the first of the divisions of her body was made, the divisions that would scatter her, in the custom of royalty, among 3 resting places rather than 1. For it was usual, with kings and queens, that the body should be divided in death, the better to multiply the places of prayer and remembrance, so that more than one soaring church might hold a part of the royal dead and offer prayers for the royal soul. And so Eleanor was divided. Her inner organs, the viscera, were taken and would be buried at Lincoln, in the great cathedral there, near where she had died, the first of her 3 tombs. Her heart was taken separately, set aside to be carried to London, and buried not at Westminster with her body, but at the church of the Dominican friars, the Black Friars, the order she had loved in life, who would hold her heart in death. And the body itself, thus prepared and divided, would be carried south to Westminster, to lie among the kings in the abbey at the heart of the realm. 3 churches, 3 parts, 3 places of prayer. The Queen scattered in death across her adopted kingdom, as was the way of royalty. We may find this strange, even troubling, the dividing of the body, the parcelling out of a person among 3 graves, but to that age it was not a violation, but an honour, a multiplying of the holy places that would hold her and pray for her, a way of spreading the care of her soul across more than one great church and gathering more prayers to speed her through the purging of the dead. The heart given to the friars she had loved, the viscera to the cathedral near her place of death, the body to the Abbey of Kings, each part in a fitting place, each place bound to remember her and pray for her forever. It was, in its own way, a kind of generosity, the dead Queen given to 3 communities of prayer rather than 1, 3 churches made guardians of her memory and her soul, and then the body prepared and the heart set apart, and the viscera given to Lincoln, The great procession formed, and the long road south began. Picture it setting out from Lincoln, in the grey cold of early December, the bier bearing the Queen's body, draped and honoured, drawn slowly southward, and about it the mourning train, the king, the household, the clergy, the powerful of the realm. The candles and the crosses and the slow, solemn pace of a royal funeral on the move. They would travel by stages, a day's slow journey at a time, resting each night at an appointed place. A town, or an abbey, or a great house along the road south from Lincoln toward London, and at each of those resting places the king would later raise his cross. Day by day, stage by stage, through the short dark days of December, the dead queen was carried south through the heart of England toward her grave, and the line of her last journey was being written, resting place by resting place, into the map of the kingdom. Come with me down that road now, and let us name the places where she rested, and where the crosses rose. Let me walk you down the road of the crosses, for there were 12 of them, and the naming of them, one by one, is the naming of her last journey. And there is a slow and solemn music in the old place names strung along that road south, the stages of the dead Queen's passage written across the middle of England. The crosses themselves would be raised in the years after, between the burial and the middle of the following decade. The finest masons in the land set to work to mark each resting place with a tall and elaborate monument of carved stone. A tower topped with a cross, set about with images of the Queen and the arms of her royal houses. No two quite alike, each a masterwork. But the places came first, the resting places of the body on its journey, and it is the places we will walk. The journey began at Lincoln, where the body had been prepared and the viscera buried, and the first of the crosses would rise there in the city by its great cathedral on the hill, where her inner body would lie. From Lincoln the procession turned south, and the first night's resting place on the road was Grantham, a market town in the same county, and there the second cross would stand. On south to Stamford, a stone town of churches, in the same broad country of Lincolnshire, the third resting place, the third cross. The slow procession was working its way down through the eastern Midlands, town by town, the body borne its solemn pace through the December country, the people of each place turning out, no doubt, to see the dead Queen pass and the great mourning train go by. From Stamford the road led on into Northamptonshire to Geddington, and the cross that would rise there is one of the three that still stand today, 700 years on, the best preserved of them all. A slender, three-sided tower of pale stone, narrow and tall and intricate, rising in the middle of a small village where it has stood through all the centuries since, the most complete survivor of the king's grief. And on from Geddington to Hardingston, near the town of Northampton, where the body is thought to have rested at an abbey, and where another of the surviving crosses stands to this day, broken now at its very top, but still tall and richly carved, set about with the shields of her royal arms, and with images of the Queen herself standing in its niches, and carved fittingly with books, the books she loved in life, remembered in the stone of her memorial. There is a thing worth feeling, as we walk this road, about the unhurried, deliberate pace of it, the way grief took its time. This was no hurried carrying of a body to a quick burial. It was an unhurried, stately, deliberate procession, day after day, stage after stage, the dead Queen borne unhurried through the heart of her kingdom, while the whole land marked her passing. And then, for years afterward, the patient raising of the grand crosses at every place she had lain, the slow, careful work of the finest craftsmen, monument by monument, so that the grief was not a single sharp event, but a long, sustained act. Drawn out across the country and across the years, a remembering made deliberately permanent and slow. There is a kind of dignity in that unhurried pace, in the refusal to let her pass quickly, in the slow, deliberate honouring of the journey and the marking of the road. We are halfway down it now. Lincoln and Grantham and Stamford and Geddington and Hardingston behind us, the body moving ever south toward London and the Abbey. Let us walk the rest of the road, the southern half, down through the home counties toward the city and the King's own Westminster, where the journey would end. From Hardingstone the road led on south, deeper into the country between the Midlands and London, and the resting places came one after another through the home counties as the procession neared the capital. There was Stony Stratford in Buckinghamshire, a town on the old road, the 6th resting place and the 6th cross. There was Woburn in Bedfordshire, the 7th. There was Dunstable, also in Bedfordshire, a town where the Great North Road ran, the 8th resting place, where the body lay another night on its slow passage south. The country was growing more peopled now, the road busier, the city drawing nearer with each day's stage, and still the dead queen was borne on at her solemn, unhurried pace. And still the places were noted where she lay, against the raising of the crosses to come. On from Dunstable to St. Albans, in Hertfordshire, the 9th resting place, where there was a vast abbey, the shrine of the first English martyr, a fitting house to receive the body of a queen for a night on its journey. And then the 10th, at Waltham, also in Hertfordshire, the place we now call Waltham Cross, for the cross that rose there, and that still stands. The third and last of the 3 survivors, tall and ornate in the heart of the town that took its name from it, the last of the resting places before the city itself. From Waltham the road led at last into London, and the 11th resting place was in the city, at Cheapside, in the very heart of the medieval town, where one of the grandest of the crosses would rise amid the bustle of the city's great market street, the dead queen brought into the capital itself. And then the 12th, and the last, and the greatest of all. From Cheapside, the body was borne on toward Westminster, to the Abbey where it would lie, and the last resting place on the road, the final stage before the burial, was at a place then called Charing, a hamlet on the road between the city and Westminster, by the river where the road bent. And there the king raised the last and most magnificent of all the crosses, the grandest and most elaborate of the 12, the great cross at Charing, standing where the road turned toward the palace and abbey of Westminster, the final monument of the dead queen's last journey, the most splendid of them all, because it was the last and stood nearest the place of her rest. That place is still called Charing Cross to this day, though the medieval cross is long gone, pulled down in a later and harsher age, and the name endures as the one most people know, the name of the place that marks, though few who say it know it, the last resting place on the road of a queen who died 700 years ago. So the road ran, the 12 places strung down the middle of England, like beads on a thread, Lincoln and Grantham and Stamford and Geddington and Hardingstone and Stony Stratford and Woburn and Dunstable and St. Albans and Waltham and Cheapside and Charing. The slow stages of a dead queen's passage south, each one marked forever, or meant to be marked forever, with a tower of carved stone bearing her image and her arms and a cross above. It is one of the most extraordinary monuments to grief that any age has left. This line of crosses the length of a kingdom, and it was raised by the hardest king England ever had, for the wife he could not keep, so that her last journey should be written into the very ground and never forgotten. And at the end of the road, at Westminster, the journey reached its close. and the queen was brought at last to her grave among the kings. Let us go there now, to the burial, and to the 3 tombs that would hold her. The body came at last to Westminster, in the middle of December, 17 days or so after the death at Harby. The patient, slow journey south ended, the dead queen brought home to the vast abbey that her father-in-law had raised, to be buried among the kings of England. And there she was given a funeral of the highest state and solemnity, for she was a queen, and she was beloved, and the king spared nothing in the honouring of her. Picture the abbey on the day of the burial. Westminster was already in that age the soaring church we would half recognise today. The great Gothic abbey Henry III had rebuilt in the new French style, all height and light and stone tracery, the burial place and crowning place of the kings of England. And into it, on a December day in 1290, came the funeral of Eleanor. The whole vast company of mourning, the king and the court and the clergy and the magnates of the realm, the candles burning by the 100 in the winter dimness, the chant of the requiem rising into the high stone vaults, the incense, the black, the grave ceremony of a royal burial in the heart of the medieval church. The body that had been carried so far was brought to its place, and the prayers were said, and the masses sung, and the queen was laid to rest among the kings, near the shrine of the saint, in the holiest ground the kingdom had. And Edward was there, the grieving king, at the centre of it, burying the wife of 36 years, the companion of his whole adult life, in the abbey at the heart of his realm. We can only imagine what that day was for him, the hard king brought low, standing in the soaring church amid the candles and the chant, while the body of the one person who had reached the softness in him was lowered into its grave. He had carried her the length of the kingdom to bring her here. He had ordered the crosses that would mark her road. And now there was the last thing, the burial itself, the putting of her into the ground, the final and irrevocable parting, after which there would be no more journeys together, no more sharing of the road, only the years of his life still to run without her, and the monuments, and the masses, and the memory. But the burial at Westminster was not the whole of her resting, for she had been divided, as we have seen, in the custom of royalty, and so on the day she was laid in the abbey. Her body lay there among the kings, but her heart was elsewhere in the city, given to the friars she had loved, and her inner body lay far to the north, at Lincoln, where she had died. 3 places held her now, 3 churches, 3 tombs, 3 communities of prayer, bound to remember her and to pray for her soul through the years to come. And over her body at Westminster, in the time that followed, the king would raise a monument worthy of her, not a cross this time, but a tomb, and upon it an image of the queen herself, cast in gilded bronze, that survives to this day. One of the most beautiful things the medieval age has left us, the gilded queen lying in eternal stillness in the candle-lit abbey. Let me take you to that effigy now, and to the 3 tombs that hold her, for they are the still heart of all this grief, the places where, at the last, she came to rest. Of the 3 places that hold her, 2 are quiet now, and 1 is a wonder, and it is the wonder we will dwell on, for it is the truest likeness we have of her, and the most beautiful, and to stand before it, even in the mind, is to come as close to Eleanor of Castile as 700 years will let us come. But let us name all 3 first, and gently, the scattered resting places of the divided queen. At Lincoln, in the great cathedral on the hill, her viscera were buried, and a tomb was raised over them with an image of the queen, near where she had died, the northern resting place. Far from the others, that medieval tomb was destroyed in a later age of upheaval, and what stands at Lincoln now is a later replacement. But the place remembers her still, the cathedral that received the inner part of her body on the road south. At Blackfriars in London, the church of the Dominican friars she had loved, her heart was buried, with another monument in the keeping of the order she had favoured in life, and that church and that tomb are wholly gone now. Swept away in the great destructions of the centuries that followed, so that the resting place of her heart survives only in the record, the church vanished, the monument lost, the heart of the Queen given to a house of prayer that time erased. 2 of her 3 tombs, then, are gone or remade, the northern and the heart tomb, lost to the far centuries. But at Westminster, over her body, the King raised a monument that endures, and it is among the supreme treasures of the medieval age. A tomb chest of stone, and upon it, cast in bronze and gilded with gold, an effigy of the Queen, a life-sized image of Eleanor lying in state, made by a goldsmith named William Tyrrell in the years just after her death, and it survives, the gilded Queen, in the Abbey to this day. Picture her as she lies there. The figure is serene, idealized, not perhaps a portrait in our sense, but an image of a queen at rest. The face calm and young and beautiful under a simple crown, the long hair flowing loose about the shoulders, one hand at the breast, the drapery of the gown falling in long still folds, the whole thing worked in gilded bronze, so that, in the candlelight of the abbey, it glows softly golden in the dimness. A queen of gold lying in eternal stillness in the worked stone church. After 7 centuries the gilding is worn and dimmed, but the beauty remains, the serene golden figure, one of the loveliest things human hands have made. Raised by a grieving king over the body of his wife, there is a stillness about that effigy that draws the heart, and it is a fitting place for this long story to come, at last, to its rest. All the movement of her life is stilled here, the journeys and the crossings, the road from Castile and the road to Acre, and the endless roads of the travelling court, and the last road south from Harby. All the restless motion of a life lived on the move, gathered at last into this perfect stillness. The Golden Queen lying calm and quiet in the candlelit abbey, going nowhere now, at rest. The frightened child carried north, the young wife tested by war, the queen who would not be parted from her king, the mother of joy and grief, the cultivated and formidable woman, the beloved of the hard king. All of it come down at the end to this, a serene golden figure in the dimness of a great church, the still point at the centre of all that grief, the place where Eleanor of Castile lies, and has lain for 700 years. Let us draw back from her now, and look at what time did to all the monuments of that grief, the crosses and the tombs, across the long centuries between her age and ours. 700 years is a long time, longer than we can truly feel, and across those centuries the monuments of Edward's grief met the fate of all things made by human hands in a changing world, and most of them are gone now, and only a few remain. Let me tell you what time did to the crosses, for there is a melancholy in it, and a wonder too, that anything at all should have survived so long. 12 crosses were raised, the finest the masons of the age could make, and for a time they all stood, tall and elaborate along the road south, and pilgrims came to them, and prayed at them for the soul of the Queen, and they were landmarks and wonders of the country for generations. But the centuries are hard on stone, and harder still on monuments that come to be seen as belonging to an old faith and an old order. The great upheavals of religion and civil war that swept England in the centuries after the Middle Ages were no friends to such things, for the crosses, with their images and their old Catholic associations, came to be seen by stern reforming eyes as monuments of superstition, and many were pulled down, deliberately destroyed, broken up for their stone, in the zeal of ages that had no love for the old Queen's memorials. The grandest of them all, the great cross at Charing, the last and most magnificent, was torn down by order of the Parliament in the middle of the upheavals of the 17th century, 400 years ago now. And where it stood, there is no cross today, only the name, Charing Cross, clinging to the place where the most splendid of the 12 once rose. And so of the 12, today, only 3 survive. 3 of the original crosses still stand, more or less, weathered and restored and battered by the centuries, but recognisably the monuments the king raised 700 years ago. There is the cross at Geddington, in Northamptonshire, the best preserved of all, the slender 3-sided tower rising still in the middle of its village, the most complete survivor. There is the cross at Hardingstone, near Northampton, broken at its top, but still tall and richly carved, the Queen's images still standing in its niches, the books still cut in its stone. And there is the cross at Waltham, in Hertfordshire, in the town that took its name from it, the 3rd survivor, restored and worn, but standing yet. 3 out of 12 after 7 centuries, the rest broken and gone, their stones scattered, their places marked now only by later memorials or by nothing at all, or, in the case of the greatest, by a name alone. But think of what it means that even 3 remain. These are not great cathedrals, kept and guarded and rebuilt across the ages. They are roadside monuments, standing in the open, in ordinary towns and villages, exposed to 700 years of weather and change and the indifference and hostility of the centuries, and yet 3 of them are still there, still standing, still bearing the worn images of a queen who died in 1290. A traveller today can stand in the village of Geddington and look up at the same cross that Edward raised for Eleanor, the actual stone, weathered and ancient, still rising where he set it 700 years on. A thing of grief made permanent that has very nearly kept its promise of permanence, outlasting the king who raised it, the dynasty he founded, the faith that built it, the whole age that made it, standing still in the quiet of an English village. A tower of stone that says, to any who know its story, that a man once loved a woman so much that he marked the road of her death with monuments meant to last forever, and that some of them have very nearly done it. Let us turn now to the king himself, and what became of him in the years after, for his is the other half of this story, and it has its own truth to tell. There remains the question of what became of the king, in the 17 years he lived on after her. The honest answer is the one that gives this story its full and human truth, neither more nor less than what happened, and we should tell it plainly. For a true love story does not need to be tidied into a fairy tale to keep its power. Edward lived on, and he remained king, and he went on being the hard and formidable ruler he had always been, harder now, the chroniclers said, for the loss of her. He turned his strength northward in the years that followed, to the long brutal wars against the Scots that would consume the rest of his reign and earn him the grim name by which he is half remembered. The hammer of the Scots, a king grown old in the saddle, relentless and unforgiving to the end. The gentleness that Eleanor had drawn out of him seemed to those who watched to have gone into the ground with her, and the king who survived her was a colder and a sterner man than the king who had loved her. And here is the fact that an honest telling must not hide, for it is true and it is human, and it does not, rightly understood, diminish what came before. Some 9 years after Eleanor's death, Edward married again. The marriage was a matter of state, as his first had been at its beginning, part of a peace with France, and his second wife was a French princess, Margaret, a young woman, many years his junior. And she bore him more children, and was by all accounts a good wife to him in his last years. He did not spend the rest of his life in solitary mourning. He was a king, and kings remarried for reasons of policy and succession and the plain need of companionship, and he did what kings did. We should not be surprised by it, nor should we let it trouble the story. For it takes nothing from the truth of the first marriage that the second one happened. Edward had loved Eleanor with everything the hard core of him could give, had carried her the length of the kingdom, and marked her road with crosses, and poured out his grief to the whole realm, and all of that was real, and remained real, even as life went on, as life does, as it must. For that is the deeper truth here, and it is worth holding as you lie there in the quiet, the truth that love and grief are real, even though life goes on past them, that a man may mourn with his whole heart, and still live, still remarry, still continue, and that the continuing does not unmake the grief. The crosses did not come down because Edward married again. They stood all through his second marriage, and his last wars, and his old age, the monuments of his love for his first wife, standing the length of the land while he lived on, and ruled on, and warred on. The grief made permanent in stone, outlasting even the griever's own return to life. And when at last the old king himself died, in the far north, on his way to yet another Scottish war, in the year 1307, 17 years after Eleanor, his body was brought south, as hers had been, all the way to Westminster, and he was buried in the same great abbey, near her, the two of them brought together again at the last in the Church of Kings. The hard king laid down at last, not far from the gilded queen. After the years apart, they had not been able to bear separation in life. At the end, after the long parting of his survival, they were laid to rest in the same holy ground, together again where they lie still. Let us turn now to the long remembering, how she was kept in memory and prayer across the years, and then to what her story might mean for us, lying here, 7 centuries on. There was another monument to Eleanor, besides the crosses and the tombs, a monument not of stone but of prayer, and it was in its way the greatest of them all, the one that mattered most to the people of that age. And we should understand it, for it tells us what remembrance truly meant to them, and why the king laboured so hard at it. When Eleanor died, Edward did not only raise crosses and tombs. He endowed with lands and money the saying of masses for her soul, and not for a year or a generation, but forever, in perpetuity, masses to be sung for the repose of the Queen's soul down all the years to come. Candles to be kept burning before her tomb, prayers to be offered for her without end. This was the deepest care the living could give the dead, in the faith of that age. For the soul after death was held to pass through a long purging before it came to the bliss of heaven, and the prayers of the living, above all the prayers of the Mass, could ease and shorten that purging, could speed the beloved soul toward God. To found masses in perpetuity for a soul was to commit the whole future to the care of that soul, to bind generations yet unborn to the remembering and the helping of the dead. And it was the most precious gift the powerful could give their dead, far more precious in the eyes of that age than any monument of stone. And Eleanor received it on a scale befitting a queen and a beloved wife. Across the years and the centuries that followed, in the vast churches that held her 3 tombs and in others besides, The masses were sung, and the candles burned, and the prayers were offered. The dead queen kept in the long remembering of the church, her name spoken in the prayers of the living generation after generation, her soul tended across the years by the institution the king had endowed for the purpose. It was a remembering meant to be eternal. Like the crosses, the dead woman held in the prayers of the living forever, never let go, never forgotten. Her soul cared for down all the ages to come by the endless offering of the Mass. There is something here that reaches very deep, deeper, even than the crosses, into what these people meant by love and memory and the keeping of the dead. To us, remembrance is a private thing, a matter of the heart, fading as the rememberers themselves grow old and die, so that the dead are truly forgotten within a few generations, slipping out of all living memory into the blank of the past. To them, it was not so. They built remembrance into permanence, into stone and into prayer, into institutions meant to outlast the rememberers themselves, so that the dead might be held in active memory and active care, not for a generation but forever. The prayers going up for the Queen's soul, long after everyone who had known her was themselves dust. It did not entirely work, of course. The upheavals of later ages swept much of it away, the masses silenced, the endowments seized, the candles put out. But the intention was eternity, the refusal to let the beloved dead fade, the binding of the whole future to the remembering of them. And in Eleanor's case, the intention has, against all odds, very nearly been fulfilled. For here we are, 700 years on, in the dark, speaking her name and telling her story and holding her for a little while in memory again. Let us think now about what all of this might mean for us. The crosses and the tombs and the masses and the long remembering as we begin, gently, to turn towards sleep. Let me take you back before we close, to where we began, to the sunlit courtyard in Castile, the fountains and the orange trees and the little dark-eyed girl growing up in the warmth and the light. Because there is a circle to be closed here, a quiet and tender thing that runs underneath the whole of this story, and it is worth feeling before we let her go. She never went home. That is the thing. The girl carried north out of Castile at 13, into the cold and the grey and the rain, never returned to the warm, bright world that made her. She lived in England and in Gascony and in Wales. She crossed the sea to the Holy Land. She travelled the length and breadth of her adopted kingdom 10,000 times over, but she never went back to Castile. Never again walked in those courtyards, or heard that water falling, or felt that southern sun on her face. Never saw again the world of her childhood. She gave her whole life to the north, to the cold kingdom and the hard king she had been sent to, 36 years of it. And she died in a small house in the flat Midland country, about as far from the warm south as a life can travel, and she was buried in a great grey stone abbey in a rainy northern city. The daughter of Castile laid to rest forever under English stone, far, so far, from the sunlit courts where she began. And yet she carried that warm world with her all her life, and never let it go. And that is the tender heart of it. She brought the south north with her, and kept it, the books and the gardens and the fruit and the carpets and the tile work, the love of learning and beauty that her childhood gave her, and she lived inside it, a little island of Castile in the cold kingdom, all her days. She could not go home, so she brought a measure of home with her and dwelt in it, and left some of it behind her in the English ground. Gardens and orchards, and the memory of a more cultivated way of living, so that the warm world of her childhood reached, through her, a little way into the cold kingdom, and stayed there after she was gone. The girl who never went home made a kind of home, instead, out of the things she loved and carried, and lived in it in exile, and enriched her place of exile with it. And that is a quiet and beautiful kind of courage, the courage of a soul that cannot return to what it loves, and so keeps it alive within itself and shares it, and is not embittered by the losing of it. There is a thing in that for any of us who have ever been carried far from where we began, by the choices of others or the turns of life, into a colder place than the one that made us, and have had to build a life there, among strangers, far from home, with no road back. Eleanor did it at 13, and did it with a steadiness and a grace that lasted her whole life, never bending to the cold place, but quietly warming it, never forgetting the bright world she came from, but never being broken by the loss of it, carrying it within her and living by it and leaving it behind her as a gift. She was loved at the last beyond almost any woman of her age, marked in stone the length of a kingdom, kept in prayer across the centuries. But underneath all the grandeur of her death, there is this smaller and more human thing. The girl far from home, who made the best of a life she did not choose, and made it, in the end, a life worth more than most. Full of love and learning and beauty and the deep companionship of one who could not bear to be parted from her. She never went home, but she was not lost. Hold that as we begin to let the dark come down, the soul far from home that was not lost, that made a home of exile and a gift of grief and a story that outlasts the stone. Let us turn now, gently, toward sleep, and toward what this long life might leave with us, lying here so many centuries on. So here we are, you and I, 700 years on, from that November evening at Harby, in the quiet and the dark, having followed a whole life from its bright beginning to its tender end. And it is worth asking, gently, before we sleep, what it is that we have been following, and why a story so old should still reach us, lying here so far away in time. For everything in Eleanor's world is gone. The kingdom of Castile she was born into, the open frontier and the conquering court, gone. The medieval England she was carried to, the travelling court and the open fields and the great castles raised against the Welsh, gone or changed beyond knowing. The faith that framed her life and her death, the masses for her soul, the crosses raised for the eyes of pilgrims, the whole vast structure of belief and remembrance that gave her death its shape. Faded and broken and half forgotten. 9 of the 12 crosses are gone. The Heart Tomb and the Northern Tomb are gone. The masses are silenced. The world that made her and mourned her has passed away as completely as she has, and almost everything that seemed permanent about her death, the stone and the prayer and the endowment meant to last forever, has been worn or broken or swept away by the indifferent centuries. And yet the thing at the centre of it reaches us still, across all that loss, as fresh and as clear as if it were yesterday, because the thing at the centre of it is not medieval at all. It is human. It is the oldest and the simplest thing there is. 2 people who loved one another, and the grief of the one who was left when the other died. Strip away the crosses and the masses and the queenship and the crusade. Strip away the whole strange vanished apparatus of the medieval world. And what is left is a man and a woman who were bound together for a lifetime and could not bear to be parted, and the desolation of the one when the other was gone, and that we understand, that needs no translation across the centuries, that is as true and as raw in our own age as it was in theirs. Everyone who has loved and lost, everyone who has stood at a graveside, everyone who has known what it is to face a life suddenly emptied of the one who filled it, knows exactly what Edward felt in that small house at Harby. Knows it from the inside, however many centuries lie between. The grief is the thread, and the thread is unbroken, running straight from his heart to ours, across 700 years. That is why the story endures, and why it can still reach you, lying there in the dark tonight. Not because of the crosses, beautiful as they are, nor the gilded effigy, nor the romance of the queen who sailed to the crusade, or the legend of the sucked-out poison. Those are the trappings, the medieval dress of the thing. The thing itself is love and grief and the refusal to let the beloved be forgotten. And those are ours as much as they were theirs, woven into us as deeply as into them. The constant human core under all the changing dress of the ages. We are not so different from the people of that far-off world as we like to think. They loved as we love, and grieved as we grieve, and a king 700 years gone, marking the road of his dead wife with crosses the length of a kingdom, was doing only what every grieving heart longs to do. To make the loss mean something, to mark it, to keep the beloved from slipping away into the blank of the forgotten. Let that settle over you now. The deep, unbroken thread of it, the sameness of the human heart across all the centuries, as we begin to let the world go soft and the dark draw close. There is one more thing to feel before we sleep, and then we will let her rest. There is one feeling left to sit with, the deepest the story holds, and it is the one named at the very beginning of this long evening. When I told you we were going to meet a woman who was loved so completely that the love outlasted her death. For that, in the end, is what the crosses mean, and the masses, and the gilded queen, and it touches something that lives in all of us. The wish, the deep and half-secret human wish to be loved like that. To matter so much to someone that our passing would mark them, that we would not simply vanish when we died, but be held and mourned and remembered and not let go. It is one of the quietest and most powerful of human longings, and we do not often speak of it, but it is there, in nearly everyone, the wish not to be forgotten. The hope that when we are gone, we will have meant enough to someone that they will keep us in memory and in love, that our absence will be felt, that we will not simply slip out of the world unmarked, as though we had never been. We build small monuments against that fear all our lives, in the love we give, and the bonds we make, and the marks we try to leave, all of them, in their way, small crosses raised against the dark of being forgotten. Small acts of the same impulse that raised the great crosses, the length of England for Eleanor. We want to be loved beyond our death. We want to matter that much. It is one of the most human things there is. And in Eleanor, we see that wish answered, as fully as it has ever been answered for any soul. She was loved that much. When she died, she did not vanish unmarked. The most powerful man in the kingdom was so undone by her loss that he wrote her grief across the whole face of the country in stone, bound the future to her memory in prayer, laid her in gold in the heart of the realm, and could not, by his own account, cease to love her, even in death. Whatever else her life was, hard or fortunate, cultivated or grasping, she was at the last loved exactly as the deepest human wish would have us all be loved, completely, and beyond death, and unforgettably, so that here we are, 7 centuries on, still speaking her name in the dark. She got the thing we all, somewhere quietly within us, long for. She was not forgotten. She is not forgotten, even now, even tonight, even here. And there is a comfort in that, to carry down into sleep. A comfort that has nothing to do with crosses or queens or the far-off medieval world, and everything to do with you, lying there in the warm dark at the close of your own day. For the wish to be loved beyond death is answered in its quiet way. Not only for queens, it is answered in some measure for everyone who has ever truly loved or been truly loved, for love does outlast death, in the hearts that carry it, in the memory that keeps it, in the small, unmonumented ways that ordinary people hold their dead and refuse to let them go. You do not need a king to raise you crosses to be loved beyond your death. You need only to have loved and been loved, and that love, when the time comes, will do for you in its own quiet way. What the crosses did for Eleanor will mark you and keep you and carry you in the only place that finally matters, which is the heart of someone who will not let you be forgotten. Let that settle over you now. Deep and warm and easing, the oldest comfort there is, that love outlasts the dark, that nothing truly loved is ever truly lost. And now let us let her rest, the Golden Queen in the candlelit abbey, and let us turn ourselves toward sleep. Before we let the dark come fully down, let me take you to the three that remain, the three crosses still standing, and let you stand before them for a moment in your mind. For there is no better place to feel the strange tender weight of this whole story than at the foot of one of the actual stones the grieving king raised, still rising where he set it 700 years on. Come first to Geddington, the best preserved of them, in its small Northamptonshire village. It stands in the middle of the place, by the old church, a slender three-sided tower of pale weathered stone, tall and narrow and intricate, climbing up in tiers of carved and traceried work toward the broken place at the top, where the cross itself once stood. Look at it. The stone is grey and worn now, softened and pitted by 7 centuries of English weather, lichened and ancient, but the carving is still there, the delicate blind arcading, the worn figures of the queen still standing in their niches, gazing out over the village as they have gazed for 700 years. Children have played at its foot for 30 generations. The village has lived its long, quiet life around it. And it has simply stood through all of it, through the centuries and the wars and the changing of the whole world, a tower of grief raised for a dead queen, still rising in the ordinary quiet of an English village, asking nothing, saying nothing, only standing, as it was made to stand, forever. Come to Hardingstone, near Northampton, where the Queen's body is thought to have rested at an abbey, and where the second cross stands by a busy road now, broken at its top, but still tall and richly worked. The shields of her royal houses cut into its stone, the figures of Eleanor standing in their arched niches, and there, carved into the stone, the books she loved in life, remembered in her memorial. The one personal touch in all that heraldry and grief, the cultivated queen's love of the written word, set into the stone that marks her death. And come to Waltham, in Hertfordshire, in the town that took its very name from the cross, the third and last survivor, standing yet in the heart of the place, worn and restored and battered by its centuries, but still there, still bearing the marks of what it was raised to be. The last of the resting places before London, the last of the 3 that time has left us. 3 stones out of 12 after 700 years. And here is the thing to feel. Standing before any one of them in the quiet, the king who raised them is dust these 7 centuries. The dynasty he founded is long ended. The faith that built them, the masses, the pilgrims who once prayed at their feet, all gone. The whole world that made these crosses has vanished as utterly as the queen they mourn. And still they stand, 3 of them in their ordinary towns, weathered and ancient and easy to walk past, 3 towers of stone that say, to anyone who pauses and knows their story, that a man once loved a woman so completely that he marked the road of her death the length of a kingdom, and meant the marking to last forever, and very nearly succeeded. That is what survives. Not the king, not the queen, not the world they lived in, but the love, fixed in 3 weathered stones, still standing in the quiet of the English countryside. 700 years after the heart that raised them stopped. Let us leave them standing there, in the gathering dark, and turn now to the stillest and most beautiful of all the places that hold her, the candlelit abbey where the Golden Queen lies. For it is there that we will let the night come down. Come with me, then, into the abbey at night, into Westminster, in the dark and the quiet, where the gilded Queen lies, for this is where our long journey ends, at the still golden figure in the candlelight. And it is here that we will lay the story down and let ourselves drift towards sleep. It is night in the soaring abbey, and the vast church is empty and dim and still, the soaring stone vaults lost in darkness far overhead, the long aisles deep in shadow, the only light the soft wavering glow of the candles that burn, as they have burned for centuries near the royal tombs, kept alight in the dark for the souls of the dead. The huge building is hushed with the particular silence of a great church at night, a silence that has weight and depth, the accumulated quiet of centuries of prayer soaked into the stone, and the cold, faint scent of old incense and beeswax and ancient stone hangs in the still air. And there, among the tombs of the kings, near the shrine at the heart of the abbey, lies Eleanor, the gilded queen, in the soft pool of the candlelight. Look at her, lying there in the gold and the shadow. The effigy of bronze, gilded with gold, worn now and dimmed by the centuries, but still glowing softly where the candlelight finds it. The queen lying in eternal stillness upon her tomb. The face is serene, calm, young, untroubled, gazing up into the dark vaults above, with the perfect patience of something that has lain so for 700 years and will lie so for 700 more. The simple crown upon the brow, the loose hair flowing loose. One hand resting at the breast, the long folds of the gown falling still and quiet down the length of the figure. All the motion of her life is stilled here, gathered into this perfect golden stillness. The journey's ended, the road run out, the restless travelling soul come at last to its final rest. She lies in the candlelight in the silent abbey, and the centuries pass over her, and she does not stir, the golden queen at the still centre of all that long ago grief, at rest, at peace, at the end of all her journeys, and there is a deep peace in the sight of her. Lying there, that reaches out and begins to draw you down toward your own rest. For this is the end of all the movement, all the striving, all the restless motion of a life. The girl carried north out of the sun, the wife who sailed to the crusade, the queen who rode the endless roads of the kingdom at her husband's side, the mother of joy and grief, the soul far from home. All of it gathered at last into this golden stillness in the candlelit dark, going nowhere now, needing to go nowhere now, simply at rest, simply at peace. Held in the quiet of the great church, through all the long nights of the centuries. The candles burn low and steady. The vast dark abbey holds its ancient silence, and the gilded queen lies still in the soft golden light, at the end of her long journey, at rest at last. Let her stillness become your stillness now. Let the deep quiet of the abbey settle over you. Let the long story be laid down, and the day be laid down with it, and let yourself begin, gently, to sink towards sleep. Here in the candlelit dark, beside the Golden Queen at rest. So let us make the last descent together, here in the quiet of the soaring church, and let me draw the day gently away from you, sense by sense, the way the candlelight draws the gold softly out of the dark, until there is nothing left to hold you up out of sleep, and you may sink the rest of the way down into the deep rest that is waiting. Begin with what you can feel, the warmth of where you are lying, the soft give of the bed beneath you, and the covering drawn over you. The whole weight of your body held and supported so that you need hold nothing up yourself. Let that warmth be the warmth of the candlelight in the abbey, soft and golden and steady, pooling around you in the dark, holding off the cold of the great stone church, holding off the cold of the night, a small bright glow in the vast quiet dark, and you held safe and warm at the centre of it. Let your body grow heavy and easy in that warmth, the limbs loosening, the weight of the day sinking down out of you into the warm dark, nothing to carry now, nothing to hold. Only the deep ease of being held, and at ease and still. Now let go of what you can hear, by giving your hearing only the gentlest things to rest upon. The deep hush of the vast church at night. That vast deep silence with the weight of centuries in it. A quiet so complete that it is almost a sound in itself. A low deep stillness that fills the dark and asks nothing of you. The faint settling of a candle as the wax gives. The whisper of the cold night air high in the dark vaults. And under it all, the immense quiet of the sleeping city beyond the abbey walls, the whole world gone still and dark and silent. Turn toward its rest, as you are turning toward yours. Let those few faint sounds grow fainter and fainter as you sink, until the hush itself is all that remains, the deep, still silence holding you, and your hearing, like the rest of you. Growing still and easy and ready for sleep. And now let go of the seeing, the last image, the Golden Queen at rest in the candlelight, and let it soften and dim and fade as your own eyes grow heavy in the dark. See her there one last time, lying serene and golden and at peace in the soft glow, all her journeys ended, all her striving stilled, at rest at last in the quiet of the abbey, and then let the image gentle itself away. Let the gold dim down into the warm dark, let the candlelight sink low, let the great church fade into shadow, until there is nothing left to see at all, only the soft warm dark, and you in it, held and easy and ready to sleep. There is nothing more to follow now. The story is told. The Queen is at rest. The crosses are standing in the dark countryside. The candles are burning low in the silent abbey. The whole long life is laid down and at peace. And there is nothing left for you to do but follow her down into stillness, into rest, into the deep, warm dark of sleep. Let go now, let it all go, and sink gently and easily and all the way down into sleep. She is at rest now, the Golden Queen in the candlelit abbey, and the long story is told, all of it. From the sunlit courtyard in Castile, to the small house at Harby, to the gilded effigy in the silent church. The whole arc of a life lived 700 years ago and carried tonight into your own quiet dark. There is nothing left to tell. The crosses are standing in the night countryside. The candles are burning low in the great church. The Queen who was loved beyond death lies serene and golden and at peace at the end of all her journeys, and we may let her rest and turn now wholly toward our own. Wherever you are listening from tonight, and whatever the hour has become while we have been away together in those far-off centuries, I hope the evening we have spent together, following one long life from its bright beginning to its tender end, has carried you somewhere kind, and held the dark off you a while, the way the candles hold it off the Golden Queen. If these journeys into other lives and other times are something you would like to keep close, you have only to subscribe, and the next one will find its way to you on the night you need it. Another life remembered, another world to slip away into when sleep is slow in coming. I think of the wide scattered company of you, settling down into the same darkness all across the world tonight, each in your own place, all of you turning toward the same rest. The way a whole kingdom once turned, for a little while, toward the memory of one woman. That is all I will ask of you. The rest of the night is yours. So let the gilded queen lie at peace in her candlelit abbey, and let the crosses stand in the dark, and let the whole story settle into stillness, and let yourself settle with it. Down into the warm and the dark and the deep good rest you have earned. Nothing more is needed now. The tale is told, the queen is at rest, and you are warm and safe and held, and free at last to sleep. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.